Start recording. All right, so this is our first session on a new book. We're reading What is Called Thinking by Heidegger. This was a suggestion from Pete from a little while ago, which is a good one. So this is like mid-1950s, usually considered beginning of later Heidegger in some degree. Some of the themes are things we've been over before. By the second half, we're gonna be back talking about the early Greeks that we were talking about in our last book. In the second half of part one, we talked about Nietzsche, similar to the Word of Nietzsche essay that we talked about a few books ago. The intro section, though, is kind of just be lead into that Nietzsche stuff and probably the least related to any of the stuff that's come immediately before. And that's what we're reading this time. I'm expecting to take about 6 sessions to get through this. So we're reading about the first 4 chapters today, which is like the first 50 pages. Since we got several new people, I just want to explain a little bit about the format. We try to do discussion, go around the table, get people's first reactions to things. In first reactions, people usually say, did they do the reading, previous familiarity with the text, if any, or thinker, etc. We got a lot of regulars who've been with this before, and I sort of know that from a lot of them, but especially new people. Any level of familiarity you have with the book, helpful to know going in. After our sort of first reactions, and which will spark off some, subjects we should get to, I'll do a little bit of an exposition on the general topics in the text. In this case, there's a number of key citations, passages, either quotes from himself or quotes from others that he brings up that we can discuss and react to. Then toward the end of our reading, there's a famous section about the tree in bloom, which we're going to talk about in some detail and go through sort of closer to phrase by phrase or line by line, get everyone's reactions to that, make sure we understand sort of what's at stake in that passage and why he's going through it. But so that's just the general itinerary, and then along the way, questions always good. Feel free to jump in with your concerns or anything like that. And in addition, if there are passages you found obscure, don't understand what he's saying, anything like that, you want sort of just general exposition of what he's talking about, or your other reactions, that's also welcome. Usually we try to do a bunch of that after the first round of the exposition, so to speak. So I've been chairing this group for a long time and try to facilitate discussions. I got a lot of familiarity with Heidegger, so does Pete, so does Dan. So we got a fair number of sort of good Heidegger scholars here to bring perspectives to bear on this. My background was at the University of Chicago in philosophy and political science, but I'm these days a software person and not a academic or teacher these days. So this is a sideline of mine, not my day job. Anyway, that's just a little bit about me and the format. I'm going to go around the table and get first reactions. Did you do the reading, that kind of stuff? And we'll start with some of our regulars. Craig?
I did the reading, finished it this morning. My first impression, typical Heidegger teaser for the first 50 pages, trying to circumambulate and get us hooked into what's going on, but not saying much about anything. The other interesting impressions I got is, as you mentioned, this came out like 54, which is like 70 years ago. And I look at everything that's changed in the last 70 years. And I had this weird moment of what would Heidegger think of emojis? But it was kind of one of those little weird sides. And the other one that caught me was from another group I've been in that we studied from a similar time frame, maybe a little bit earlier than that, was Sigmund and Anna Freud's nephew, that most people don't even know is a nephew, Edward Bernays, who wrote a classic book in 1928 called The Engineering of Consent, and a later book called Propaganda. And I found it interesting when Heidegger was sort of praising the technical side of things, and now we're into this marketing and fake news and propaganda and everything as considered engineering. I'm not as willing to praise engineering as he seemed to be at times in this thing. So even though my background is engineering and science, but I found that was an interesting twist to have two things kind of collide on me. in terms of thinking about that and where he's going to go with building perception, building representation, and the fact that we're now much further along the wasteland of Nietzsche into a really difficult territory now. So that's one kind of my overview. I know it's out in left field, but it was still kind of a fascinating juxtaposition to have hit.
I want to react to a couple of those things. I mean, one is that you talk about how he spends 50 pages sort of hemming and hawing without quite getting to it, right? There's a definite rhetoric going on in the first part of this book, which is it's like designed to exasperate the positivist who's expecting clear exposition. You know, the Bertrand Russells of the world are going to be pulling what's left of their hair out, right? Because it's a different kind of rhetoric. It's the rhetoric of enticement, of mystery. It's the why is he saying that? Instead of, you must, here's a premise which I expect you to accept, and here's something I can deduce from it, and a clear line of reasoning, which is kind of the rhetoric of compelled assent. It's the rhetoric of I can show you the deductive process why you should think this way, and so if you're rational, you will follow me along these steps. That's sort of a kind of positivist rhetoric that he is very studiously avoiding. Right, he's even deliberately exasperating people who have that expectation, and instead it's this sort of oracular style of I'll throw out something completely unsupported as a bare statement, and I'll even tell you later everything so far is a completely unsupported assertion, but I want you to wonder why anyone would say that, right? I want to get you curious about why anyone would say that, and eventually I'll reveal a little something about what I was thinking when I said it, but along the way, it's a veil dance, right? It's like I'm not telling you all the reasons why I think this, right? Rather than why you have to think this. It's meant to elicit curiosity and maybe a certain amount of frustration along with the curiosity. On the engineering stuff, I mean, there's definitely stuff going on here with this, reaction to science and technology and all that kind of stuff, which we'll get to more when we get to the exposition. A fair amount of what you're calling his praise of engineering is the faint praise of engineering, if you get me. So he's dancing around the faintness of the praise, but he's also just trying to win the space to talk about something else. He's trying to talk about this kind of philosophical thinking, metaphysical thinking stuff, and he's relating it to other things in maybe in poetry and so forth, but not directly to the, put it this way, the pressing concerns, positivist concerns, and maybe history, where we are in history now, sort of concerns of the age. He's mentioning all those only to step around them, almost like he's just trying to shoo them out of the way. But by the end of our first session here, one of the things I set, the first four, is I do think he starts getting the substance. As soon as he puts in the Schopenhauer quote and then reacts to it with the tree and bloom thing, he's getting to the substance. And I wanted to get all of the sort of throat clearing and hemming and hawing out of the way and get to that first piece of, I can put it this way, true philosophical meat before we called it a session. That's just why I picked that we should go this far in the book before breaking off the first reading. But understand your reactions.
Yeah, I would tend to agree a little bit real quick that even the whole thing, it was very refreshing the way he was dancing compared to what we're used to with propaganda now, with marketing, where everything is stated bluntly, even though it's totally false, it's still stated bluntly as the truth. And it was nice to hear the dance, see the dance again. So I tend to agree with you when you said he was kind of dancing there. That was nice to hear, because we're not used to it anymore by any means.
Yes, but it's still useful to recognize that this is a species of rhetoric, right? This is definitely a studied piece of rhetoric. Okay, Pete.
Yes, so I did the reading. Well, sort of. I thought it was the first three, so I kind of read those 3 weeks ago, and then I read the three of them earlier this week again. I've forgotten how long he took to get going, and just kept asking the question or making the assertion that we're still not thinking. And what does he mean by thinking? And he's eliminating all these other things that if you asked a student in Freiburg, what does thinking mean? they come up with different answers, and he's going to go through each of those and say, "Oh, that's not what I mean." And yeah, I thought the book actually started with the tree. That's what I remember from reading it 20 years ago. And apart from that, he goes into, touches on a few areas he's, that are areas of his concern. He's kind of hints at them, some of his predecessors and his criticism of them. And that's pretty much my first impression. Yeah, just surprised after we did the basic problems of phenomenology, where there he'll do 200 years and 4 scholars in one class. So maybe it's also a sign of age. He's emeritus professor now. He doesn't have as much energy as he had in the 1920s. And maybe he's also thinking this is going to be my last class. I'm going to retire. So, he's planned it out carefully. And like you said, do one veil at a time to get closer to what he really wants to talk about.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I have to first just clarify. Did you get to reading the tree part in section 4 this morning or something, or you haven't read that again?
No, I just realized we were going to read through 4 when you spoke first.
I understand. Okay, we can talk about the various things going on in the sort of illusions things. It can feel like it's taking a while to get going, and I think it definitely, the tree thing, stands out. And then there's some of the stuff on Nietzsche, which a lot of which is recapitulation of stuff we saw in the Nietzsche lectures and some of the other things. But the last 2 sections of part 1 are kind of a encapsulation of reaction to Nietzsche, something like that, which isn't completely new in the sense some of the stuff was there in the Nietzsche lectures in the 30s, but it's still pretty weighty, and the whole second half is more or less completely new. But we want to get to other people's first reactions before I try to characterize the first section more. Dan?
Hi. I read this book about, I think, 3 years ago, and I read the first 4 chapter this week. And what's interesting, I think I read between my previous reading and now, I read all the, the contributions, ponderings, and all the rest. And I was surprised, like, probably how much I missed in my first reading now. And especially talking about the leap, his attack on technology and sciences doesn't think. Schopenhauer, it seems like he's admiring him, but he's not. He's just preparing, as Peter said, preparing the ground to dismiss them and so on. But I love it. And especially as you mentioned, the tree in bloom, I think I was surprised by that section. And reading it after, I don't know, all this time, I found it quite interesting. But that's it for now.
Sure, I think you're right that there are several allusions to sort of that kind of this way less public thought from the 30s, only published much later. Noteworthy example of that is the idea that there's something about the matter to be thought that is turned away from man, turned away long since, that sort of stuff. And we've seen a little bit of that in the discussion of the Greeks, but it's much more explicit here, although it's, well, more explicit isn't the right term. He makes the claims, he doesn't support them, he just throws them out there, right? But it's again this trying to get you curious about it, but he's saying it forthrightly as though it is something that he knows, not it might be something like that. So there are, I agree with you, there are signs of some of that thought in the 30s, but again, it's not laid out in an exposition in the same way that you get in early Heidegger. It's much more of the come to office hours after class and ask me what I meant by that, right? Or wait until lecture 5, right? And I might give you another sentence, right? And part of that is just meant to try to awaken this curiosity that will get the students to be asking the questions themselves. Some of it is an exasperating form of rhetoric for someone who's trained in other forms of rhetoric, let's put it that way. But we can come to the substantive things in a bit. Joe, your first reactions, reading and so forth. Still on mute.
Well, I was pleased to realize that everybody was explaining this dancing around and getting one's taste buds whetted for curiosity, because I certainly felt that way. I did read all the way through, and I read about the tree. I was really quite taken by that at the very end. And so I went back and looked at it again this morning, and I'm interested in how he's approaching that. I'm still not quite aware how this all fits in, but that's, as you pointed out, he's sort of drawing us in, and that's nice to learn. But so I'm just interesting. First time I've really encountered this. I did sort of get the impression that I'd gotten some hints of some of this stuff in our earlier work, maybe the book on phenomenology. We did one on Husserl, a year or so ago. And these things where you're sort of looking inside the brain, let me put it that way, and figuring out how it connects to, the process of ideas. It's always been interesting. What is the relationship between ideas and thinking on the one hand and the extant reality that he otherwise talks about? So I'm interested in following along. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we'll get to some details on what everything that's going on in that passage. But just to relate to some of the other stuff we've done before, remember back when we were doing the what is called the thinking parts, not the thinking parts, the what essence of truth stuff and Theaetetus, right? And the question of is knowledge perception, right? This is heavily looking at something like perception and immediate perception as a source or place in which something like truth happens. Is very much what this is about, and tracking the truth reasoning perception tangle, put it that way, through this is it's very much the same subject matter is what I'm trying to say. He's not talking about the Greek notion of aletheia here, but it's in the background. Whether or not truth is a matter of the correctness of statements and resides in statements, or is an event that happens in a face-to-face encounter between a mind and a reality, something like that, or an actuality rather. That's sort of the subject matter that's in play here, and he's sharply differentiating himself from what he sees as the Schopenhauerian modern idealist view, and from what he takes to be the typical view of positivist modern science, something like that. And one of the reasons that this passage is important to me is it sharply differentiates Heidegger's, especially late Heidegger's position from, if I can put it this way, some continental subjectivisms, which it is often confused, right? He is not a continental subjectivist of the Schopenhauer to Nietzsche stripe, right? And this passage brings that out. We can talk about all of what that means here. But there are definitely things in that passage that neither Schopenhauer or Nietzsche would have written that way. And we'll get to that when we get to the exposition. But all right, so Risa?
Hi. So a couple things. It was certainly much easier to read than Being in Time. I actually found it a lot more straightforward, these lectures, which I definitely appreciated. A couple of things that I found interesting was that when you start thinking, he said that what you're thinking about immediately begins to withdraw from you. And which I never thought of it really that way. And but I wonder actually what Heidegger might be addressing, and why Being in Time is such a crazy dense thing, is the limits of language. And how is our language preventing us from actually truly thinking about something, not necessarily correctly, but truthfully, I guess. he kind of brought that up in, I don't know if you read Poetics by Heidegger. And he actually, I'm a creative writer, and he tried his hand at poetry too. He was written some poetry. But he actually, I think he was actually making the case that, you know, creative writing sort of helps you, actually is closer to truer thinking about a subject. Though he doesn't necessarily tell me exactly why, but he did sort of do that in the Poetics. And The Wasteland Grows. Yeah, I had read that before about Nietzsche. Had written that, and I thought his discussion of it was good. And then also he did bring up the fact that when you say the word Nietzsche, it immediately brings up all these other ideas and stuff. And so that's what happens actually. And I think that's what he was saying, that kind of limits our thinking, is that when we bring up something like a computer or whatever random thing, we already have these preconceived ideas of what's going on. So he actually ended up saying that Socrates is the one who actually thinks. And if you read Plato's dialogues, Socrates does not walk into any discussion with a preconceived ideology. He tries, I thought, tries to be sort of this empty vessel and just pushes the subject forward by just asking questions. And in that case, in that sense, what they're thinking about, like during those dialogues, is in fact withdrawing, but at the same time, I think rushing towards what is perhaps the most thought-provoking and true thinking. So yeah, anyhow, that's, I probably said more than I should.
Yeah, first reaction, that's fine. I mean, so brought up a lot of things there. I mean, on the poetry stuff, he does, he brings up Hodel in here several places, including in connection with Socrates, and he talks about how, you know, what is it, poesy at its highest and thought at its most profound touch and are only separated by a cleft, something like that. That's his metaphor, which if you think about it, I don't know if that's touching from top to bottom, but he's trying to relate them, but he does say that they're not quite the same thing, right? They're not trying to get at quite the same thing. But in terms of language shaping thought, absolutely, I would think that for mature Heidegger, language is the medium in which thought takes place. Yes, there's perception as well. Yes, there's immediate experience and all those things and the way we associate and so forth. But it's still in crafting the language in which things hang together with meaning, something like that, that we reach what he is calling thought.
But it's different though from mathematical language. So
absolutely,
the language that we use is sort of subjective. It's not as absolute as, say, mathematical language.
Sure, the point is not about language. The point is about what he means by thought, right? He's saying that the particular thing he's trying to denote by thought is something whose realization occurs in meaningful language, right? Things that you can craft into meaningful language where different minds can react to that meaningful language, each in their ways of what they bring to it and so forth, but they're reacting to the same thing because the language of the saying is what they share. That is the place, the medium, the event of what he is calling thinking. Thinking is not something that just happens inside of our heads. Thinking is something that that is also shared, that is verbalized and externalized. Sometimes it's not simply expressed, but it has this same between us commonness that language has.
Well, that would be discourse, to quote, I guess, Plato.
Yeah,
Plato
he's not. But he Heidegger is not adopting the terminology of other philosophers who disagree with him on this point. He's crafting his own, and he's not using the word thinking for Aristotle's discursive logic, and he's not using the word thinking for Holderlin's poetry. He's using it for something like this language of philosophical, metaphysical thinking that is crafted into words, right? So something like the thinker is the sayer, is the person who makes the who crafts the sayings, right? So the crafting of the sayings that have this philosophical weight that people can see and share and react to the full meaning of the words in is kind of what he means by this thinking as an activity. He likens thinking as an activity to something trivial like handicrafts, right? He wants to say that it's a kind of making, and the kind of making that it's a sayer, right? A thinker is a sayer who crafts sayings of the form we're getting over and over here. I think that's partly why he keeps repeating all these sayings. He has sayings like the wasteland grows from Nietzsche. He has sayings like we are a sign that is not red from Holderlin. He has his own saying about the most thought-provoking, the thought-provoking age that you still are not thinking. All of these are trying to show by example that the medium in which thinking happens is something like the crafted semi-oracular aphorism, right? And then seeing the many sides of that is the fuller activity that thinking consists in. It's trying to engage with such things in a way that can see them from all sides, get everything out of them and something like that. And yes, I agree that that has a lot in common with sort of creative writing. It's a place where it can touch poetry or something like it. But to me, this is not primarily a point being made about language. It's a point being made about a particular kind of thing you can do with language, which is what he thinks thinkers do. Sorry, we have someone on the phone whose name I don't see who has their hand up. Is there a question?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm dialing in. But you said sayer, or was it
Yes.
seer?
No, sayer, as in one who
because-
says.
Yeah,
Seer,
I think
a seer is one who sees, and a sayer is one who says. And yes, they're often equated with one another in Old German.
right. I think the word Dichter in German
Yes.
captures some of the idea of, especially somebody who has prophetic powers in some ways, and which I think Heidegger later in his life, especially when it came to Holderlin and others, he kind of went over to the poetic. He kind of owned up to the poetic nature of his own musings, and I mean, what's his name, the French poet Rimbaud and others, they think, yeah, that is the job of a poet, to be a seer.
Yes, or to be a dictor. I mean, and this is, language as the house of being is the late Heidegger phrase that tries to encapsulate this. And he's not going all the way to that because the theme here is thinking rather than language. But I think Risa is right to bring it up that it's one of the things going on here, and it's why there's all of these solutions. But he talks about the way in which he thinks the Greeks responded to their forms of art, and he's thinking especially of their poets and tragic poets specifically. And he thinks that there is that kind of relation to the language in which Greek thought was expressed that way. He sees that in, if I can put it this way, modern poets of the Romantic stripe who have nostalgia for all of that and are trying to recreate all of that, something like that, which he sees in Holderlin. So anyway, yeah, Dichter would be the German for the thing I think he's getting at here. Sorry, there were several other things from Risa's comments. I'm not going to get them all, but the other one I wanted to touch on is this withdrawal business, because he has a long discussion early on. Well, I don't know how long it is. It's an involved discussion with many steps about this withdrawal business and what the withdrawal means that we should probably go through in some detail. But he's not just talking about how anything that one thinks about in some sense withdrawals. He's talking about something like what most deserves to be thought about, and that what most deserves to be thought about in his little oracular phrase of thought-provoking, the thought-provoking age that we still are not thinking. The thing that deserves to be thought about if we're not thinking is something which is withdrawn from us. It's evading us. So that means that the thought-provoking has the characteristics of a not yet thought and a mystery and a pursued. But a mystery and a pursued that you're trying to think about but haven't thought about has the character of what is withdrawing before you. And then he points out that if something is withdrawing before you and you're pursuing it, that you are pointing towards it. And all of this is part of his trying to, he's not even telling you that what he's doing is about to explain an oracular saying of Hölderlin, but that's what he's doing. He hasn't brought up the Hölderlin quote of "we are a sign that is not read," but he goes through all this stuff about withdrawal, and then he springs on you, by the way, the whole relation I just laid out to you about this way in which people who are seeking to know something in thought are searching after a mystery that is getting away from them, and therefore towards which they are pointing, towards which they are drawn, but at which they have not arrived. That whole set of structural relations that a pursuing thinker has to the thing he is trying to think about, that is worthy of being thought about, is exactly the relationship that Hölderlin is alluding to in this poem, which he just springs on you at the end. That the structure of "we are a sign that is not read" is exactly what is involved in that, thinking toward the mystery, something like that. And this is another example of this sort of dancing rhetoric of wanting you to understand why anyone would say this. All of the stuff about withdrawal is like a interpretation before he's giving you the text he's interpreting of this phrase from Hölderlin, right? So the phrase from Hölderlin has an interpretation, and it's about this withdrawal business, but he gives you the interpretation before he gives you the line that it is interpreting, and then he springs the Hölderlin line on you and says, now you know what this weird thing he meant. Meant when he said this thing that seems completely obscure in the poem. What could anyone mean by a sign that is not read? How could that make sense? I've already told you what sense it makes before I even sprung the line on you. So it's a reversal of the order of the interpretation and the text being interpreted there. That's a piece of this curiosity rhetoric, if I can put it this way, trying to elicit your curiosity about why someone is talking about this. Dan, you got a comment?
Yes, to say something briefly on what Risa said. So around this time, Heidegger said that his thinking in being in time was in the right direction, but the language was metaphysical. So she wondered why the language was different, and in being in time and thinking and versus language. That was it.
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. I mean, in a way, that's his earlier language is challenging in a technical sense. It's meant to talk to neo-Kantians around him. It's the language of the tradition he's trying to connect to, and so it's as technical as their language, but it's not yet his own mature way of thinking about these things, something like that. That I think that's what you're getting at with the difference. So the early Heidegger can have this kind of this way, weighty, verbose German technical philosophy sort of speak to it. And there's some people for whom, because they're trained in those traditions, that's particularly clear, or at least particularly precise, if not clear, because they've read tons of Kant or something. And there are academic philosophers in particular who like the early Heidegger for that because it seems more rigorous to them. But it's also can be impenetrable to anyone who isn't trained in those traditions. And can seem dense, obscure, etc. for all those reasons. And here he's definitely in kind of a freer voice of his own. He's not constrained by trying to be understood by centuries of neo-Kantians, right? He's just trying to say it the way he would say it from his own intuition. Now that's a little bit of a simplification because it's still pretty oracular here. It's not meant to be as precise, or as, in that sense, it doesn't necessarily. Yeah, there's a precision to the early stuff that's not here. So is what I'm trying to say. But that shift is conscious and intended on his part. He thinks that this is a more mature, more his own voice, and less of a voice that is indebted to the tradition he's trying to, the historical tradition he's trying to explain or trying to connect to. So I don't know if that helps, Risa, for the difference between this and being in time.
Oh, no, I understood that. I was just saying this was so much more enjoyable to read, including that on poetics than being in time, which was hard to get through. Yeah, no, I understand why he wrote Being in Time the way he did, for sure.
Enough. Sure. Great. Sorry. I can't tell if your hand is still up from the previous comment on the phone, or if you're good for us to go on. Okay. Payam?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
I can. You're a little faint, but
okay. So yeah, the first impression that I got was the paradoxical nature of thought, the way he explains it. So he mentions that unlike swimming, which you can see how it happens, thought isn't something that yields itself to a simple definition. He even mentions previous thinkers, they reflected upon it and then they had to find their way out of it. He even goes on and says that science does not think, which sounds like a really strong statement. Again, he goes with the relationship between learning and thinking, and he mentions that you have to unlearn before you can learn. So again, there is that paradoxical nature that keeps coming back. So that was my take.
Yeah, that's fair. But I mean, I think a large portion of this is he's giving thinking a technical meaning of his own to refer to not everything that anyone could possibly mean by the word, but a very particular activity he's trying to outline. And when someone reacts to the statement that science is not thinking and considers this some sort of attack, it's like they're only hearing in the word thinking that this is something good, right? It's like it's a double plus good word. So if someone says, X is not double plus good, then they're, all they're hearing is the associations of the warm fuzzies of the word and the warm fuzzies being denied to something. But there's lots of things that any particular activity is not. If it's a particular thing that it is not all the other things that it is not. And thinking is a distinct activity from science, is what he's trying to say. And yes, that is a delineation, because there's some people that will use thinking as just this sort of very loose category into which everything they can imagine that has any mental aspect to it would fall. And he's mostly just distinguishing that's not what I mean by thinking, right? Thinking is something more specific than that, more philosophical than that. It has this specific philosophical character, if I can put it that way, as well as this particular historical character, this particular language character, all those things. And that's what the original oracular saying is trying to tell us, right? If you're trying to tell us that we're still not thinking, this is presenting thinking as not something which is an everyday thing, which everyone is always doing with their breakfast cereal, but as a calling or ideal that is off in our possible future if we set ourselves on the way to it, right? It's a activity to be attained, not something that everyone has always already done as a matter of course. So, and that's what the original oracular, most thought-provoking age comment is, or not comment, saying is meant to, start by pointing out is that thinking is something that we might aspire to, might be called to, but it's not something that we can consider ourselves as having already achieved. And a little bit later, I think it's in chapter 3, he'll mention, this is true of all of us, me as well as you, me first of all, right? He's not excluding himself from this categorization. When he says science does not think, he's also saying, I am still trying to think, right? And it's something that teacher and student are trying to learn to do together, right? So that's this rhetoric of invitation, if I can put it this way, or of calling, that this is something that we're on our way towards. But there's no question this is very different from the tendency to hear in words only their positive or negative connotation and then react to that.
I think he also mentions at the beginning of chapter 4 that we are not just doing negative in the certain sense of delineating. There is some positive substance to his not definition, but perhaps methodology.
Right, but I mean, this is just another example of there's an element of contemporary reactions to language that he is critiquing here, which is that people hear only positive or negative connotations of individual words and other people's sayings, and then they react to those, and then they impute to the thinker the things that they think they're reacting to. That is not thinker, the speaker, right? Things which are only there in their own reaction. So at that point, they're not actually reacting to what the person has actually intended and what they said. They're only reacting to the emotions they had about the person saying it, right? And this is definitely something we see in contemporary life quite a bit. We see it in the forms of marketing and such that Craig was alluding to earlier. And he is not only pointing this out, he is sort of deliberately provoking such reactions in order to shoot them down as that's too superficial to understand what I'm saying. Right? You cannot understand what I'm saying without paying attention to the carefully crafted way in which I am using the words to refer to particular things. And he can't make you do that. He can only point out to you that when you don't do that, you're the one who's doing it, not him. The other example he gives here is this is part of a critique of what he calls one-track thinking at times. He talks about how we tend to moderns tend to use abbreviations for things. Why do they use abbreviations for things? Because single letters are sufficient to convey the thought, because everyone only has the same thought. Everyone only has the same thought. You can just use the word you for university. It doesn't have to be a place where one truth is arrived at or studied, like the full word says. It can just be you. And everyone knows that you is a place where one studies. It's the university. But it's not the university as a full Latin word speaking of the ideal of a unified single truth that everyone is seeking there, which is what the original word actually means if you hear the whole thing out. You don't need to hear that. You just need to know that we're referring to the same thing as one another. And because we're all going to mean the same thing, a single letter of the alphabet is sufficient to denote it. So it's the predictability of the speech and reactions that makes it possible to abbreviate it. Every word in the language that could begin with you is not being possibly referred to. If you say you know exactly what everyone else thinks. So the fact that there's sort of a one-track thinking means that the richness of the language becomes redundant. It doesn't convey extra information, right? The extra information it appears to convey, or would convey if you heard the whole richness of it, is unnecessary if you're on one track. Because if you're on one track, just telling me where the turn happened is sufficient to take me all the rest of the way down that track, right? And he speaks of one-track thinking as requiring a kind of univocity, right? Meaning one voice, right? So one-track thinking, univocity, abbreviation, and the jumping to the conclusions by hearing only the emotional connotation of the word are all being equated here by him into one thing. And that one thing is not listening carefully to the specific thing that the specific speaker is saying, and instead just expecting him to be saying the same thing other people have said before, that you've heard before, so that you can say, oh, this is that track. I've already had my reaction to that track. I only need to deploy it again here. So I don't know if that helps, but that's the sort of constellation of things he's referring to there when he talks about the univocity and the you example, and the way in which people are just reacting to sort of is this a positive word or a negative word? Does that help?
Yep, it helps. Thank you.
Great. Nathan, first reactions.
Okay, so I went through the reading one time. First reactions are, I thought that it was very readable. I thought it was going to be more difficult than that. But I really liked, you guys just mentioned it, but the way that he positioned thinking as requiring going into the withdrawal and thinking from there, and not focusing on the what has withdrawn, but actually he didn't say abiding, but being like really thinking from within the withdrawal itself. I was struck by that in the very beginning. And then the part about man being the sign and the pointing, and that being the essence of man, and where man comes into his own, in some sense, in thinking, happens there. So that kind of brought to mind phenomenology. I don't think he mentions phenomenology, but I kind of got an invitation into a phenomenological approach to thinking from within the withdrawal. So yeah, I thought it was great. The part on Nietzsche, I think I need to hear more comments about that. I enjoyed that part, but I don't think I got it. And yeah.
Well, we're gonna get a lot more on Nietzsche in parts 2 and 3. I mean, part 2 is all about Nietzsche and Superman in Zarathustra. That is sections are chapters 5 through 8 that we're going to do in our second session, and then 9 and 10 are about the eternal return, basically. So we're going to get 6 of his chapters, 2 of our sessions, fleshing out the Nietzsche quite a bit. The only part we've gotten so far is just this, this reference to the Wasteland grows remark in chapter 3. We can talk about that a little bit here, but the point is that's here like a drop hint and foreshadowing, right? He's not fully getting to the full engagement with the Nietzsche material until basically the start of lecture 5. And before then, it's just another one of these sprinkled oracular sayings like the sign that is not read, etc. I do want to come back to the sign comments. I think that there is a bunch going on there. You're right, he doesn't mention phenomenology here, but a lot of the same understanding of Dasein as the place or site where being appears to man, or where truth happens, is a subtext here. And what's noteworthy about the treatment in this book is that he's doing that without any of the technical terminology of being in time.
Yeah.
He's referring to the same things, but he's just trying to put it in the common sense ways that people think about it without any of the technical terminology, right? And we'll get to that when we get to the tree discussion, but it's also there in the withdrawal discussion, the withdrawal and sign discussion. There's an underlying sort of man's calling idea in what he's explicating as thinking as something like attention to the possibility of the appearing of being, something like that. And that there's that as a calling, or as something that the activity of thinking, we could do if we set our minds to it, something like that. Not just our minds. But that's what I hear in some of the withdrawal stuff. The other thing that's there in the withdrawal stuff, though, is this idea of the matter to be thought turning away from man. Not that man just doesn't attend to it enough, but there's something about the matter to be thought that has turned away from man and turned away long since. And that's a rather complex thought that we get a bunch about in the some of the 30s unpublished stuff, and we also saw a bit in the book we did last on early Greek thinking. Mm-hmm. This notion of the idea that there's something about appearing of the notion of the aletheia notion of truth as opposed to the correspondence notion of truth to man that was briefly glimpsed in people like Heraclitus and then disappeared again or something like that. So speaking of that as something like the withdrawal of the matter to be thought. The other place where we've seen that same notion in the stuff we've done together in this group is when we did the Word of Nietzsche essay. He had that same notion of there's something about the nihilism that he has Nietzsche describe that is something like this, that sort of a closing off. In that essay, he alludes to it in the question of turning technology. He says directly, what is happening to being? Nothing is happening to being, right? That's the oracular phrasing for that notion of the matter to be thought having turned away from man is a nothing happening to being. So anyway, there's a constellation of thoughts there about the fact that the degree of understanding of these metaphysical things, or this the possibility of this revelation of the event, if you want to call it something like that, not being simply dependent upon man's will, which is part of what the sort of later Heidegger will talk about as releasement. But the thing to understand there is this reversal of the agency idea in that both that withdrawal stuff and in that is there something closed off to man rather than man closing off to something. He's trying to get away from this technological understanding, this technological sense that you get in Nietzsche in particular, that all of these things are matters of man's powers and how man chooses to use his powers, as though the fundamental underlying determining thing is human will, right? If the fundamental underlying determining thing is human will, then all of these are just powers of man, and they're deployed this or that way according to what man wills. And man's will is the driving thing in charge, so to speak. And Heidegger thinks that drops you into a technological world and begs a bunch of questions about what it's for, something like that. And we saw that in some of his other essays we didn't read yet on questions concerning technology. But I think in this withdrawal business, there is a implicit critique of Nietzsche, is what I'm trying to get at. Both Nietzsche and technology, as both of them involving this kind of means end instrumental view of man's capacity to reason. Something like if reason or truth are merely at the service of man's will and man's drives, then it's treating being as man's creature, or something like that, and thinking as a mere tool. And to Heidegger, it's a degradation of the status of thinking to think of it as a mere tool.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that as well. He said that it's actually the technological way of thinking that makes I think he calls it the machine, right? The technology as a tool possible versus
Absolutely.
the other way around. And I also thought it was interesting that he folded in this sentence about Socrates being the purest thinker, and then he equates truth and beauty, and with the notion of concealedness, and then it just kind of moves on. I was like,
well, we definitely want to talk about the Hölderlin reference there. There's there's two references to Socrates. There's one of them is about because he didn't write, he's the purest thinker of the West, something like that. And then he immediately reacts to people who are reacting to purest thinker as only heard double plus good, and so on. But leaving that aside, that's the sort of first reference there. And it's important to realize that that's also a critique of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's first book is all about locating the decisive turn away from the tragic worldview in the Greeks in the excessive rationalism of Socrates, something like that. And Heidegger is disagreeing with that here. But the other place where Socrates comes up is in the Hölderlin citation. So this is Hölderlin talking about Socrates rather than something Socrates himself. And it's the second bit of Hölderlin we get. This is the one about who has deepest thought loves what is most alive, right? That's a line from a Hölderlin ode. And this is, in the end, the wise incline to beauty, something like that. But we can definitely get to that as one of the other sayings along the way. The whole early section is just a sprinkling of all of these weighty sayings to react to that are not fully interpreted, right? The one that actually gets the fullest interpretation is the sign that we are not read, as we are a sign that is not read, and it got its interpretation before the statement was even put in front of you. But none of them really get a full interpretation. They're illusions out there that are meant to invite the students to begin thinking about things, and they're creating a kind of atmosphere, but they're not a full exposition of a structure you're supposed to understand, like the early Heidegger would have given us by now. Dan.
Yeah, I thought on this idea. So like, as you said, like nothing happened to being. We point to this by pointing away from it and one-sided thinking and so on. It's kind of like it's something by absence or by pointing away, and it kind of implies a background where something was there and it happened at the time, or at least, I don't know, like ancient Greek, they took notice of these things and we are no longer taking notice of this. So it's more like it's something that's happening by absence or by moving away from that. It's more like, and we live in one-dimensional world, and that's kind of like we point by living in this one-dimensional that there was more dimensions and we are now no longer aware of them. So it's a background that it's kind of missing, or trying to understand all this against the background.
I did have a question about that. I'm sorry. It
No,
kind of
please.
builds on what you were saying. So he said one-track thinking is not one-sided thinking, but he also said it was building while transforming. I think those very words. And I was a little confused by that. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know if anybody
So
clarify
part
that better.
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I fully understand it, but I can lay out some of the connections. The understanding of technological thinking that he's pursuing here is that, and that he's relating to one-track thinking, is something like the way in which truth appears under the era of the essence of technology, something like that, or Nietzschean thinking, or the end of metaphysical thinking, is that thinking is a human tool that acts by construction. It doesn't act by discovery. It doesn't, learn from the from what is already objectively there, what is true, and let that be revealed as a revealing of truth. It doesn't have the calling to be revealing of truth. It is the calling to conquer and transform what appears to the human being for the human being's own purposes. And that means that it makes, it doesn't simply receive, but it constructs the systems in which it lives. It constructs the ordered world, right? That it uses its categories, which are its art and constructs, to make the very truths in which it walks around. And you can see something like this in Hegelianism. You can see some of this even more so in Nietzsche's notion of truth. Nietzsche will say that truth is the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live. In other words, we build constructions that master part of the complexity or chaos of our world, but there are constructions, and there are constructions which we made for our limited purposes with our limited insights. They are, little manifestations of our will to power in the full Nietzschean understanding. But Heidegger is reading that as something like, instead of a receptive truth revealing itself through man, calling aspect of something like objective thinking, there's instead a will to transform into the ordered for our purposes. So why does this result in one-track thinking? This results in one-track thinking because in the end, the thing that matters most to the transformative thinking of technology is, can I master things more? Can I order things more according to my purposes? Do I have more power over them? Do I accumulate more power to order the standing reserve of what is into in line with human desire, something like that? And to the extent that one does so, the one track you're on is increasing the degree to which human desire masters the real, something like that. So that is going back to the beginning of modern philosophical subjectivism. This is the conquest and possession of nature for the sake of the lease of man's estate that you got back in Descartes, right? It's the we know only what we make of Hobbes, and this whole modern project takes on the character of, we turn truth into a making, and then we live in the construct that we make. So that's the sense in which this is a one-track thinking is constructing the thing in which it is living. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, and these are subtle ideas. There's a lot of reaction to, big formations of previous philosophy going on in them, sometimes in very terse shorthand. Okay, so I think we've gotten through. Did I miss anyone for first reactions? I may have. If not, I want to. We've already mentioned several of them along the way, but make sure we cover at least the specific sequence of saying. So the first of them is his own most thought-provoking, the thought-provoking age that we still are not thinking. I think we've talked about that a few times, but thought-provoking is the maybe the phrase we haven't talked about the most, but I think most people get it. Does anyone have any interpretation they want to offer of this phrase, or questions they have about it, or role that it's portraying here before we get on to some of the remarks from other people? His own, what is most thought-provoking question. Do we need to have more on that, or are we good already on that saying? I'm looking at you, Joe. You have to tell me if this is completely comprehensible or completely incomprehensible, because I don't know.
No, this is very interesting. I can't say that that I had any prior developed thoughts on the subject, so this is quite interesting just to follow.
Okay. So the next sort of one of those oracular sayings was that we are a sign that is not read, and this is what I was claiming. The interpretation is in the withdrawal, right? That is, we are a sign that is not read is meant to be a statement lying off there in a poem by Hölderlin that might be completely incomprehensible to someone, and they can have no ability to have access to what could he possibly mean by that. And what the trick that Heidegger performs here is he gives you a full interpretation of an event in thought, something like that, a structure in thought that has the character that little oracular phrase from Hölderlin winds up being an apt description of it, right? And he gives you the interpretation before he gives you the phrase. So you don't know that that's why he's doing it at the time when he's doing it. But the idea that when he is truth seeking, man is a pointer at the truth. That's the underlying claim. So if you're seeking a truth you do not understand that is withdrawing from you, you have oriented on truth and you've become a pointer at truth. The truth has already affected you long before you have done anything like attained it, right? It has oriented you, and it has illuminated itself, revealed a piece of itself as a that toward which you are oriented in its withdrawal from you. So it has the characteristic of an unknown mystery withdrawing from you, on which thought is oriented, and to which thought is attracted, or which thought is seeking. Okay. Now, he doesn't mention any of this here, but I'm going to. The structure that is just described there is in Platonism called the good, right? As this hidden beyond being that that thought is oriented towards, that beauty is the outward appearance of, that attracts. Much of the same structure is discussed in Plato's Symposium as the relationship between beauty, good, and love, actually. So, and I don't think that Heidegger here is referring to that, but I think that Hölderlin is perfectly capable of doing so. Hölderlin was very interested in Platonism, Neoplatonism, and so on. Perfectly willing to have such, perfectly capable of having such references in him, if I can put it that way. So I think that the structure of pointing into the withdrawal that Heidegger is elucidating is something he is perfectly comfortable with as a description of how he thinks of something like thinking's relationship to truth or the event, something like that, in his own terms. But it is also not as far from at least some interpretations of Platonism or Neoplatonism as you might think.
I did have a question about that, and you kind of touched on a little bit. So does Heidegger believe in Plato's true forms?
I would say no, but he is going to talk about idea here and what we mean by ideas. So idea is going to be a problematic here. The closest we got to hearing his direct understanding of it was a little while ago when we did On the Essence of Truth, where he gave us a kind of very favorable interpretation of the allegory of the cave from Plato. And then he gave us an interpretation of the Theaetetus, where he thought that Plato was moving us away from the notion of truth as unveiledness or appearing of things to man, and toward a notion of truth as correctness, and relating this to the correctness of statements. So the claim in the Essence of Truth, broadly speaking, is that the notion of what the essence of truth is undergoes a historical change, and originally it means something like rising appearing of truth to man, something like that, which would fit entirely with the allegory of the cave understanding of things. And then it turns into something more like the correctness of statements, in the sense of, does my representation correspond to the objective state of affairs? And that historical change in the meaning of truth, which is certainly affected by the time of Aristotle, say, Heidegger, is trying to locate as occurring between the first and second halves of the dialogue, the Theaetetus. Okay, and we went over that in some detail as to whether or not, he manages to substantiate that claim in that dialogue, but that's outwardly what he's saying there. So in that sense, he's not endorsing Plato as the best guide to the relationship between ideas, appearing, truth, etc. Although he did kind of fully endorse the allegory of the cave explanation of this sort of reorientation of man on something like true being. But that's all from a previous book we read together. So I don't know how much that helps. Okay, I'll assume it's good enough. So the place this is going to come up again is when we're talking about what it means to form ideas, and that's going to be the immediate subject matter when we get to Schopenhauer and the tree, toward the end of what we want to talk about. Okay, so anyway, we talked about the Holderlin thing. I wanted to bring out this point that the sign that we are not read in this withdrawal structure is also something that you would see, like parts of that withdrawal structure stuff. If you ran across that in Dionysius the Areopagite or Nicholas of Cusa, you would not be surprised. Let's put it that way. Both Neoplatonists, I mean. And if that's where Holderlin got it from, you also wouldn't be surprised, because he definitely read those people. Holderlin, I mean. Okay. The Nietzsche's Wasteland remark. So that's the next sort of oracular. I'm sorry, that's not the next one. The next one he drops is the Holderlin on Socrates. The who has most deeply thought loves what is most alive. This is there's a little short ode by Holderlin called Socrates and Alcibiades that he's extracting from here. But the particular line he pulls out is, who has most deeply thought loves what is most alive. And he brings out the fact that the thought loves are the two verbs are the dominant things in the passage, and that they're in the German coupled right next to one another. So the immediate sort of romantic Holderlin context is why is old Socrates infatuated with young Alcibiades? And the answer is because he seems in his youth and beauty and promise he seems most alive, and the aged wise in the end inclined to beauty, something like this. But the underlying reason for that, the aged and the aged wise inclining to beauty, is the couplet that he actually quotes: most deeply thought loves what is most alive. And this is definitely kind of an endorsement there, and it's also meant to be, if I can put it this way, an enticement towards thinking. He's told us all these oracular things about thinking as something we're on the way towards and we're not actually doing yet. But why? Okay, it's interesting that this is so complicated or so mysterious, what thinking is. But what is it about thinking that makes it an activity that we all want to be on our way toward? Something like that. And this is to be crass about it in the form that Craig said. This is his advertisement for why you should be engaged in thinking. It's meant to be something which is attractive about thinking, but I think it's also fair as to an attraction he actually sees in it. There is an adherence to something positive in this, which is not a mystery thing, it's a love thing, put it that way. And he's seeing that in Holderlin, and this is going to be important when we're contrasting it with the Wasteland coming up, let's put it that way. Okay, so there is some I've got it this way, some spiritual high standard of that is meant to be attractive here in the activity of thinking, that is being alluded to in this oracular poetry, something like that. Did anyone have reactions to that passage? I don't know if it manages to affect people or not. You can easily fail to land if no one is interested in romantic poetry, but.
So this is in lecture 1?
I believe it's in lecture 2.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on page 20, the Socrates and Alcibiades thing. Who the deepest is thought loves what is most alive, who has looked on the world, understand youth at its height, and wise men in the end often inclined to beauty. We are concerned here with the line, who is most deeply thought loves what is most alive. Right? That's the passage. And he says, a curious rationalism which bases love on thinking and an unpleasant kind of thinking which is about to become sentimental, but there's no trace of that in this line. He's going to immediately contrast this with logic and Hegel, but this is meant to be his proof that where poesy is lofty and thinking profound, they can touch, right? Which his previous example of was the "we are the sign that is not read" example, but this is meant to be the second example of that. Where does poetry and thinking touch? And in this assessment of Socrates by Hölderlin is the answer he's giving. But I just have no idea if that lands with anyone. You have to tell me.
Just to be clear, as a question, he doesn't say why it has to be like that. Why thinking profoundly should lead us to love. It's more of an observation, the way I see it, right?
Basically correct. Hölderlin does, but Heidegger here does not. He almost immediately goes to contrasting all this with logic and logistics, something like that, and then to technology handicrafts. The contrast here is between something like thinking that, how to put this, the positive Bertrand Russell analytic philosopher types thinks that thinking is about logic and ratiocination and is something that is done by calculating machines. And Hölderlin thinks that thinking is something that Socrates does deeply, resulting in him loving what is most alive and seeing that in the beauty of youthful Alcibiades. So Heidegger is drawing a contrast between a kind of sentimental spiritualism of thinking from a kind of, if I do this way, hard-nosed logic chopping thinking that he sees other ideals of philosophy around him as upholding for their students. Right? And he is firmly putting himself on the former side of that distinction. That's the real purpose the reference has here.
Because there was the passage about logic and logistic.
Yes.
The study of logic. He
immediately after, exactly. That's immediately after the passage about the has deepest thought loves most alive.
Right.
So there's a contrast between who has deepest thought loves what is most alive versus the scientifically fruitful science of logistics. Dan?
Yeah, I was thinking there is, I think Heidegger also, like, I think in the work of art, he's talking about beauty a lot, but this reminds me like Dostoevsky, for example, especially in Brothers Karamazov, where he says something like beauty will save the world, and puts beauty, like Dostoevsky puts beauty beyond everything. Like it's the most primordial thing that drives theology, drives thinking, drives truth, and so on. And I remember there like contrasts, like Ivan, is the abstract thinker, with was Dimitri, who's involved in life and loves life, and it's in pursuit of beauty. And by the end of the book, the conclusion is that what Dimitri is doing is the right thing and not what Ivan is doing, which is abstract thinking and so on. And should be something like beauty that drives everything. It's there in the background. And I love that, especially in Dostoevsky. But I think Heidegger is on the same track here with beauty.
Well, I think what is going on here is there's definitely a common appeal to, if I can put it that way, put it this way, that same romantic spiritualism, something like that, that you have in Hölderlin. You also get some of this in Nietzsche, who says that we have art lest we perish of the truth, something like that. You get it certainly in Platonism, right? Where beauty is the thing which mediates between the thinker and the good, something like that. And it's there in lots of classical Western spirituality, for that matter. But all of that is in contrast to the understanding of thinking as a machinery of calculation that is useful for technological purposes, something like that. There's a sentimentalism here about what thinking is that is trying to position it as having a kind of spiritual nature or calling, something like that. But it's not much more than a contrast. It's not much more than a matter of atmosphere here. It's not presented as an argument. Pete?
Yeah, so what I'm attracted to here rather than the poetry is where kind of on the paragraph that starts on page 21, he talks about taking the leap into the river, tells us what is called swimming, and the notion of embodiment, because in the previous lecture, he also talked about the hand and how we needed the hand to think. And I came across this a few weeks ago where somebody said online, Chat GPT doesn't think because it doesn't have a hand, and they pointed to the passage.
Yes, right.
In Heidegger, and I'm wondering how that fits into the whole not yet thinking, that thinking requires embodiment. And usually with Heidegger, I've understood that as when you're writing with a fountain pen, your hand is moving faster than you can, say, deliberately think, kind of like playing a musical instrument. At first, you have to think of the notes, put your finger in the right place, create the sound. But at a certain point, your brain gets it and you move faster than you can think or calculate. So you can play music faster than your brain can instruct your hand to do it, just like Heidegger writing with his fountain pen.
So I understand the thought you're making, but let's be clear, right? When we're talking about faster than, it's not that your brain is instructing your hand when you're writing or playing, but it's faster than your conscious ratiocination about it, right? It's still your thought that's doing it. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to the embodiment claim, and it will come up again in the tree example when we get there. On the leap into the river, there's a definite other illusion here that in this context of romance and beauty, we have to pay attention to. This is Kierkegaard, is what's being referred to here, right? And the leap that is also going to be referred to when we get to the tree passage again. But the Kierkegaardian leap is one of faith rather than into rivers or the ground on which we stand, something like that. But it is the same sense of the not so necessarily even the embodied, as it's the committed, something like that. But in that contrast in the Kierkegaard context is also away from and beyond beauty. Beauty is an entry-level stage in that Kierkegaardian understanding. There's the aesthetic, the moral, and the spiritual in that order, of which the aesthetic is the entry-level stage, but it is a stage. But anyway, I don't see too much here that's the embodied thought alone. I think there's more of that in the tree case. I agree that there was some of that in the hand case. But yeah, and there's all kinds of things we can say about the requirements of thinking, something like that, because some of it is language, some of it is embodiment. He's going to deny that the embodied thing, which has all the embodied awareness but doesn't have language, thinks. It's not just ChatGPT that won't have that for lack of embodiment. It's also the dog that won't have it for actions with language, and maybe you just have to cross the two. But leave that aside. I think it's a little bit of a distraction. But Craig had a comment. Sorry.
Quick question, probably off topic, but just a quick question. Was Heidegger at this point aware of Kurt Gödel's work?
I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't get any indication that he is, because he's still attacking the things that Gödel had already shot down. So.
Yeah, I would think not, right? I wouldn't expect it.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, sorry, Pete, do you have another comment, or your hand's still up from the last one? Okay, and our person on the phone whose name I don't have, 151, do you have a hand up for a comment? Or go ahead.
By the way, sorry, you can feel free to rename me to Sam.
Okay, yes.
By the way, is anybody else also reminded of that kind of polemical essay that Rudolf Carnap wrote about Heidegger? Well, not just about Heidegger, but I think overcoming of logic by metaphysics by logic, or something like that. And a lot of people think that he was just trashing Heidegger, whom he knew, by the way, and he had even started a book club to go through Being and Time in Vienna. But he left a way out for Heidegger, and saying that I don't consider what he's doing as, ratiocination, as somebody like Bertrand Russell would call it, thinking, but he may very well be doing something expressing emotions, sentiments, and that's fine. That's what Nietzsche was also doing. It's just that Nietzsche wasn't basically, by his rhetoric, giving an impression that what he was doing was had very much to do with logic or science or something which can have some sort of imperative, scientific seal of authority, which has a lot of prestige, in that time and in our own too. So,
I don't think either Heidegger or Nietzsche need to borrow any seals of authority from science or anything else. But I agree with you that that's sort of the attitude Carnap had, but it was part of this sort of early 20th century through mid 20th century sort of positivist program that wanted to dismiss all statements that weren't empirically verifiable as being merely emotive expressive. And this is like the most exploded thing ever since, it just doesn't work as a piece of
philosophy. I mean, they themselves change their minds very quickly, and in fact, anyways, that's a bigger debate.
I'm just saying. Even the positivists have abandoned that ground, right? So it's a
no. They didn't. I mean, that was a very maximalist program, but that program continues in other, less full-blooded varieties. In fact,
of course,
part of the culture.
I'm referring to the particular thing you talked about that Carnap was referring to, and he said because he's not doing logic or science, he's just expressing emotion, which is fine. Expressing emotion is a fine thing to do. It just doesn't have anything to do with science or logic, right? That sort of position is one that's just, even the positivists gave that up by the latest, the early 70s, if not the late 60s. It's not a position anyone takes seriously anymore. But even in positive circles.
I don't buy that at all. Anyways, that's another debate. But
it is.
I would say that. So, are you saying that there's no difference between Nietzsche and Heidegger in their poetic way of expressing things?
Absolutely
I would say Heidegger comes across as a much more of a bona fide academic philosopher compared with Nietzsche.
Yes, certainly the early Heidegger does so, and certainly he was much more of an academic, and he certainly did much more of rigorous history of philosophy stuff, especially in his early stuff, although less so here. But I don't equate them at all. But the reason I don't equate them is not for a stylistic judgment of them or a judgment of them from the outside, from the standpoint of a logical positivism, to which I do not adhere in the slightest, but because they disagree with one another on the actual substance of what they're talking about with each other, right? So it's not an exterior view of them that puts them in this or that same camp, about which I'm just completely uninterested, but they're actual debates with one another that I'm tracking and interested in here. But anyway, that's it's just a question of whether or not we're actually on the topic from my point of view. Okay, I want to, the next one of the remarks that we were trying to run through this set of oracular remarks we get as we steer towards the tree, so to speak, preferably not in a car. But the next one is the Wasteland remark. And this is from Nietzsche. This is Nietzsche being poetic at the early in book 4 of Zarathustra, if I remember correctly. This is the oracular remark is, the wasteland grows, and we'll later learn that the extra piece of the gloss of it is, woe to him who hides wastelands within. So this is, the wastelands remark. We're going to get more exposition about all this and relating it to the Nietzschean notion of the last man in Zarathustra in our second session. But here it's just thrown out there, and then it's related to a lot of going to this way. He mentions Spengler and declinist thinking, and then tries to distance what Nietzsche is saying from that, while also saying that it is more far-sighted than that, if I can put it that way. And he says multiple things which are normally interpreted as very positive about it. I emphasize that these are sayings of thought; they are true sayings of this sort of thing. Do people have reactions to the? I realize it hasn't been fully explicated yet, but to the wasteland grows remark. Either questions about it, where it occurs, or why Heidegger is putting it in here. In what sense does he think a wasteland is growing? Craig. You're still on mute, Craig.
Is there any shift over to T.S. Eliot from 1922 when he wrote The Wasteland?
I think so, in the sense that Eliot read Nietzsche.
Okay.
I think the dependence is entirely that direction. So Eliot is thinking of that. He's also, of course, thinking of World War I, right? But when he's choosing that, there's also a common background they're both reacting to, though. I think the other source for Eliot is Grail myth stuff, honestly, where you have the wasteland stories. But Eliot is reaching back well over and through Nietzsche, but he is certainly also aware of the Nietzsche, I would say. I don't think Nietzsche is referring to the Grail myth. Sorry, Risa?
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for interrupting you on that thought. No, wasn't he referring to nihilism when
Yes.
the wasteland grows? And then he was making a distinction between destruction versus devastation. And it seemed to me after that, that he was hopeful that we can indeed think that it's not, yeah.
So you're right that Heidegger distinguishes between destruction and devastation, and that there's something more uncanny about devastation. Devastation is where nothing can grow afterwards. He does think that Nietzsche is referring to nihilism, and Heidegger is referring to nihilism. Nietzsche is not primarily referring to devastation. He doesn't make that devastation destruction distinction that Heidegger adds on, but he is definitely thinking about nihilism. From Heidegger's own understanding, he has his own understanding of nihilism, which he does see going on, so to speak, in the modern world. And in his understanding of nihilism, Nietzsche is in the thick of it, so to speak, rather than out of it. Now, on his own self-understanding, so is Nietzsche in some respects. Nietzsche thinks he's, going through nihilism to overcome nihilism or something like that. Heidegger, we see in his other works on Nietzsche, I'm not saying we're seeing it yet here, but in his Word of Nietzsche essay or in his Nietzsche lectures, has a notion of nihilism that he is partly borrowed from Nietzsche, but into which he includes Nietzsche. And that notion is something like that the disappearing of the problem of being and the disappearing of attention to the appearing of the truth of being, something like that, is the thing which actually deserves the name of the ongoing event of nihilism. It is the nothing happening to being of the problem of being disappearing from thought, something like that. And he is including Nietzsche in that. For him, Nietzsche is another place in which that problem remains occluded, so to speak. That problem has withdrawn from man's experiences. So yes, the wasteland growing is referring to nihilism. Nietzsche is using it to refer to nihilism as Nietzsche understands it, and Heidegger is using it to both agree with that Nietzschean diagnosis, but also subtext, background. He doesn't simply disagree with Nietzsche about European nihilism, about which he has a somewhat different diagnosis. Does that help?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes. So So is there a distinction here? Nietzsche sees nihilism as something fairly recent that came up because Western man in the Enlightenment lost religion, whereas Heidegger is saying that the nihilism is because metaphysics ignores being, therefore we've been nihilistic since Plato, or does the nihilism come more recently for Heidegger, that, you know, like Nietzsche might have been able to see the way out of metaphysics, but he didn't. Therefore, we've been stuck in nihilism since the end of metaphysics.
But all fair questions, but neither Nietzsche nor Heidegger is thinking that it's something as recent as the Enlightenment. In the case of Nietzsche, right, he's thinking of it as an unfolding of Western history that goes back to Plato. And in the young Nietzsche, he diagnoses the initial event of it as Socrates' excessive rationalism and siding with Euripides against Sophocles and all that kind of stuff, right? And so but that may be only a young Nietzsche. But the more mature Nietzsche, it's still nihilism as an ongoing event is meant to be something like this.
And the early stages of logic,
Sorry?
in a purely aist.
James, you're talking in the wrong line or something. Sorry, but thanks. Sorry, Pete. The point is that the pure Nietzsche has a view of the whole unfolding of Western history as being a very long process of nihilism coming out from under wraps or something like that, as the metaphysical world, the world posited behind the world, decaying, right, not being able to maintain itself, and those values refuting themselves or undermining themselves. And we can talk about, you know, Nietzsche's full historical understanding of that, but it is not something that Nietzsche regards as being recent in its ongoing logic or its inception or the original mistake that sets it off. The full manifestation of it, Nietzsche does think, is recent in the sense that it is now sort of fully blown in upon us, right? It's matured, right? It's matured particularly in the modern metaphysics of belief in progress, and that he is equating with the last man and so forth. You might also equate it with the Hegelian system, something like that, which is another example for Nietzsche of the excessive rationalism that was there at the beginning in Socrates, something like that. So the Nietzschean diagnosis of Western nihilism is something where there's a current culmination of something which was set in motion long ago, or something like that. Now, sorry, let me finish on Heidegger for just a second to contrast. And with Heidegger, you know, he's been very mysterious as to points of origin of this, right? We saw that in all the early Greek thinking stuff. We'll see it again in the second half of this book when he gets to Parmenides. He, in the section about the withdrawal, says not only is the thing which is most deserving of to be thought turned away from man now, but it turned away long ago, and we will immediately ask when did it actually happen, and he doesn't answer the question. He also says in some sense it's always been turned away, right? So he's very ambiguous about that sort of point of origin question. But in terms of the full manifestation, which is a second thing, a stage in both of them, he sees it as being in Nietzsche. The full modern manifestation of culmination of Western nihilism is the technological worldview, which he identifies with the Nietzschean one, right? He thinks the Nietzschean one is the mature metaphysics of consummate subjectivity or something like that, that winds up issuing in not necessarily what Nietzsche wants it to, but winds up issuing in something like the technological world. And is there a connection between that technological world and the criticism by others of the disenchantment of the world and so forth? Perhaps, right? They may both be reacting with the same antipathy to an aspect of modernism that they don't like, that they regard as relatively recent. But Heidegger is not someone who thinks that if only we could go back to the time of Hölderlin and a little bit more romanticism and a little bit more enchantment, we wouldn't have this problem, right? Does that?
Yeah, so let me sort of put it like this. So Nietzsche would say things have been bad since, the Socrates overtook the tragic age, or Christian slave morality became the dominant way of thinking, but they only became bad nihilistically when we moved from that to meaninglessness. So we might have had Christian slave morality, but to the person going to church, they still had a meaning to their life. But now, post Hegel and German idealism, Nietzsche would say, now it's become meaningless, and that's the modern nihilism. Would that be right?
So partly, but I mean, Nietzsche thinks that and we're going to get to this in chapters 9 and 10, right? Nietzsche thinks that there is that in the devaluation of the apparent world in favor of the true world that you get from that earlier version, there is already a spirit of resentment that is the essence of the move of nihilism, or saying no to being, something like that. And so on his diagnosis, he doesn't think that the superficial lack of meaning is the core thing. He thinks the underlying psychological resentment is the core thing. That's Nietzsche's own diagnosis of the historical formation. But leaving that aside, what causes the acute version in the modern time? The answer is when belief in anything like the Hegelian system becomes unbelievable, when you have the Schopenhauerian pessimistic reaction to Hegel, right? That's when you get classic nihilism. Classic nihilism to Nietzsche is Schopenhauer. It's the pessimistic reaction to Hegel, and so it's the elements of what Schopenhauer sees, right, and the pessimism he sees. That is the nihilism having arrived for Nietzsche, and it's also the philosophy he grew up on and was, committed to in his youth, right? The Schopenhauerism he was trained upon is to the later mature Nietzsche what he means by European nihilism having arrived, and that's the meaninglessness of pessimism, right? So the mature Nietzsche thinks that the pessimism you find in Schopenhauer is there in the antipathy to the will, right? That he already sees in a spirit of resentment. He's going to trace all the way back to the classics, right? But that's a diagnosis. What he means by nihilism having arrived is Schopenhauerian pessimism. Does that?
Yeah. So from Schopenhauer, yeah, I'm leery of going with the resentment, psychological resentment, because arguably that's always been there with Cro-Magnon men. We don't know that it suddenly appeared in the year zero.
Yes, but I mean, young Nietzsche thinks that there are things in Greek tragedy that are absent of that do not have such resentment in them, and that can be argued. Okay. He could be wrong about that, but that's what he believed. But I think, by the way, that he is wrong about that. But again, that is still what he believes. But the other thing I'll say is that whether or not this issue of resentment is merely psychological or is fundamentally metaphysical is going to be the actual subject matter of lectures 9 and 10 of our present book, right? Because it looks like that's just a matter of psychology, but Heidegger is going to make the case that it's actually about being. So they're more connected than you might think. But we'll get there in our third session.
Okay, well, we'll get back to it, sure.
Yes. No, good, all good stuff. Dan?
Yeah, I agree with you, and especially with, like, first, this modern manifestation of nihilism we see, like, for example, in Weber with excessive rationality, and with Marx with alienation, and it's Junger with the total mobilization. But I think, like, as you said, like in Nietzsche just tried to solve it by shifting the values around, like putting other, like taking some values and rearrange them in different ways. Like he wanted to flip Plato pretty much, but Heidegger said this is the problem, like having values and having this will to arrange values, that's the root of the problem, and it goes way deeper than Nietzsche thought. And Nietzsche is the problem, as you said. Nietzsche is part of the problem also.
Yes, I mean, his diagnosis of Nietzsche is, yes, Nietzsche tries to invert Platonism, but inverted Platonism is the same structure, first of all, and second of all, he's trying to willing to overcome nihilism. Why nihilism cannot be overcome by willing it, because the willing to overcome part is exactly what is nihilistic, because it is putting not truth in charge, but man's drive and purpose in charge. And if man's drive and purpose is not ordered by the truth to which it is open, then it is aimless, right? The idea of a self-directing will that is not oriented on an outside that is real to it doesn't work for Heidegger, and that to him is the modern subjective problem. But that's a good segue to the next quote we want to get to, which is, we're almost at the tree, but we're not quite at the tree. The beginning of or near the beginning of the fourth, after a bit of learning about Spengler, we get the Schopenhauer statement. This is on page 40. So this is he mentions this from Schopenhauer, but he also says that Nietzsche still agrees with it. This is the point of youthful Nietzsche, taught philosophy by Schopenhauer, sees Schopenhauer's famous work as the world as will and representation, seeing the world viewed from the inside as will, and the world viewed with abstraction by the mind, something like that, as representation. And the duality of those two is the sort of mature Schopenhauerian system, right? But the Schopenhauerian axiom there is, the world is my idea. And then this is the description of what he means by that the world is my idea. The world is my idea. This, like the axioms of Euclid, is a statement whose truth must be recognized by anyone who understands it, though not a statement of the kind that anyone understands who hears it. Okay, so leave aside the next part. First thing to understand is the whole tree thing is going to be Heidegger reacting to that claim that if you understand this statement, you see its truth. Heidegger understands that statement, but he does not think it's true, right? And that's what the tree example is going to be about. But to have made us conscious of this statement, and to have connected with the problem of the relation of the ideal and the real, the relation of the world in the head, the world outside the head, this, in addition to the problem of moral freedom, is what gives its distinctive character to the philosophy of the moderns. For only after thousands of years of trials with purely objective philosophizing did we discover that, among the many things that make the world so enigmatic and so thought-provoking, the closest and most immediate is this: however immeasurable and massive the world may be, yet its existence hangs by one single thin thread, and that is the given individual consciousness in which it is constituted. And the point there is, the world as experience, the phenomenal world, the apparent world, is constituted by the individual consciousness. That is the claim of this passage. And the claim of this passage is that you do not understand what is meant by world unless you accede to that. World is a construct. And for Schopenhauer, the proposition that the world is a construct of the mind is what he takes to be the Kantian Copernican revolution, right? That is the turn that modern philosophy has made when it became critical. Seeing the world as something which is a projected thing, a project of the mind, right? A movie made by the mind to interpret experience for the organism, right? That is to Schopenhauer the point where he entirely agrees with Kant and agrees with modern philosophy as modern subjectivism, and by the way, agrees with Hegel and Fichte. They're all of German idealism, down to and including Schopenhauer, who was otherwise critics of many of the other people's interpretations of Kant, right, are agreed on this. They're agreed on understanding by world a made thing that is made by the mind as the house of apparent experience, something like that. And that's, you can see that as being an axiomatic thing because it's what they're trying to say the word world means, right? But it's also not just a terminological thing, right? The claim is experienced world is the proper meaning of world, and that world is a made thing that was constructed unconsciously by the mind. Okay, questions about what the Schopenhauer means in the passage? Because I don't think we can understand what comes after without understanding what Schopenhauer is claiming there.
So this is just, you know, your default German idealism. I guess maybe goes back to Kant. I think Fichte with his I creates the world.
Yes.
And I didn't realize Schopenhauer was following that.
Yeah, in the case of Fichte, it's explicit that the I creates the world, but at least it's a transcendental ego, not the individual consciousness, right? Schopenhauer here is going from the transcendental ego to the actual individual consciousness, which is a particularizing move that that's a place where he's disagreeing with Fichte and Hegel, honestly, because they have much more either transcendental in the case of Fichte or intersubjective and social in the case of Hegel notions of what this self is that's doing the world constructing. But Schopenhauer is saying, no, the individual consciousness is projecting the world. And he's saying that because he's reading Kant as being the sort of constructivist person who's explaining the machinery of the mind and how the machinery of the mind, for Schopenhauer's reading of Kant is that Kant has explained how the movie projector of the mind works, right? And that the world that it creates is the necessary illusion in which we live, right? The world is representation, right? But that world is representation is a function of the mental machinery of the organism. And what differentiates Schopenhauer from the other German idealists is that he locates this not in some transcendental structure of minds in general or rationality in general, but in the particular consciousness of the particular person, right? So that's, if there's a specific difference in Schopenhauer from the other post-Kantian German idealists, that's it. Go ahead.
And he's responding to Hegel's absolute spirit in this case.
Yes, and he doesn't want that absolute spirit to be as godlike as Hegel makes it, and he also doesn't think that it is either as transcendental as Fichte has it or as intersubjective and socially constructed as Hegel has it. Okay. He thinks that the individual psychological, personal, individual human mind makes and projects the individual psychological, personal, individual world. And he himself is putting that together with world as world representation, going back to Leibniz, of will and appetite, appetite and representation being put together, right? So he is connecting the lessons of Kant with the previous Leibnizian monad view, and he's getting, everyone has their individual world, that is their individual construct, that is the movie created by their individual embodied mind, right? And without any belief that the generality of that structure renders it transcendental or renders it, not simply material or something like that you get in Fichte, or the idea that the way in which that construct is dependent upon the embodied intersubjective human consciousness, which is not simply in an individual mind, but includes all their language and cultural inheritance and all that other kind of stuff that you get in Hegel, because Hegel thinks that the objective spirit doesn't just live inside individual minds. He thinks it lives in entire societies and languages and philosophies and so on. Right. So each of the other positions in German idealism has takes on what is the entity that is doing this world projecting, right? Whether it's an objective spirit or a social spirit, or whether or not it's an individual spirit. Schopenhauer's semi-materialism is very much on the side of it being an individual psychological spirit, right? And he's even regarding that as a function of the organism, and he's regarding the will as being more primary in that than the representation. The representation is a tool of the will to Schopenhauer, and that's also, by the way, why that's where Nietzsche starts, right? Nietzsche starts from the proposition that, you know, the individual embodied organism with its will primary has its thoughts and its minds as one of its functions for being able to exercise its willful purposes in the ununderstood chaos in which it is embedded, right? So I'm just explaining Schopenhauer's philosophy and how it relates to Nietzsche's philosophy. I think Heidegger is correct here when he says that the world is my idea is something that Nietzsche agrees with Schopenhauer about, right? That he has not moved on from Schopenhauer in this. This is a place where, although in other respects, Nietzsche is less idealist than the other German idealists, this is a place where he entirely agrees with them. This is, you know, what you also see in Nietzsche's sayings like the truth is the kind of error without which creatures like us cannot live, or that, you know, that will or desire is higher than art is higher than truth, right? All of those sorts of things that you get in mature Nietzsche are following up and, if anything, heightening this this sense coming from Schopenhauer, not reversing it. Dan?
Yeah, so first, I agree, like Heidegger kind of hates Schopenhauer, and especially for this too, for proposing will and then for collapsing everything in our conscience, like the world is our representation. And I remember there was like, I think in his letters to Junger, he said something like Junger admired Schopenhauer, and Heidegger claimed that what he did to Nietzsche, he's not, like, that's unforgettable, because Nietzsche never escaped this this influence of Schopenhauer, even if you try to move like from pessimism to nihilism and so on. And one more thing, I was surprised, like reading modern physicists, like I think, or even Tregmark and a few others that I read, how often they go back and agree with Schopenhauer, like with this kind of worldview that Schopenhauer proposed. And I think that's our very modern, and we still believe in, we think in that what Schopenhauer proposed, and it's, yeah, I think it's still with us, and we take it for granted what Schopenhauer proposed even these days, and even in, yeah, that's
I mean,
it.
I think it's not everyone, because of awareness of this point, is coming from Schopenhauer, but certainly a lot of even a lot of people who consider themselves in other respects Hegelians or in the Hegelian tradition of Marx on the left, et cetera, are they wind up in this version, right? They're going to particularize in the same way that Schopenhauer does, in terms of Heidegger not being able to forgive Schopenhauer because he trapped Nietzsche in subjectivism, something like that. That entirely fits with what we're about to get to in the next passage. How much is sort of modern thinking, you know, indebted to the decision of Schopenhauer? I don't think all of it is. I think that there's a significant portion of continental thought is, and that goes through the Hegel tradition. I think a significant portion of if I can put it this way, neo-Kantian influenced scientism is, and that's what you see in someone like a Tegmark, I think. But there's also traditions that are Anglo-Saxon traditions that are not part of the continental tradition, that are not that influenced by either Schopenhauer or even before him Kant, or that are only marginally influenced by Kant, and they have notions of empiricism and materialism that are, you know, more objective than that and less subjective than that. And so I don't think that's entirely true that the modern world is committed to this as its, you know, mature philosophy or something like that. There are schools, there are a variety among the moderns, but it is certainly true that this is the dominant strand of traditions influenced by German idealism, other than those who have broken with that for reasons stemming from Heidegger and later later developments in the tradition we're actually going through ourselves. Yes, this thought has not disappeared, right? When you hear people talking about, you know, this or that being socially constructed, they're talking about the same sort of stuff that you would get from Hegel, that is along the lines of the world being something which is a project, and the technological sense of if the world is a project, then it is moldable by human social purposes or even by individual human will, right? That is very much an ideal out of this out of this tradition. Not specifically Schopenhauer, but the same tradition that he's in. But anyway, all of this is just explaining the world is my idea. And this is the he then contrasts this to, not in contrast, he mentions all this alongside of a lot of empirical human psychology, just basically to make sure that he registers that he's not disagreeing with the ability of empirical psychology to make correct empirical statements about the science of man, before he's going to have his actual disagreement with Schopenhauer, right? Which is what the Tree and Bloom is all about. The Tree and Bloom is all about, he's going to disagree with this statement of Schopenhauer, not only that the world is my idea, but also that everyone who understands this statement agrees that it is true. Okay. I note, by the way, that he used the passive voice there, a statement whose truth must be recognized by anyone who understands it. You have to ask who's doing the recognizing there, and is that a project, and so on. But there are a few inconsistency arguments against Schopenhauer that could be raised there, but it's not where Heidegger goes. Heidegger is not interested in a logic chopping, niggling objection to Schopenhauer. He's going to go for the whole canon, right? Take it head on. All right, this all leads us to the tree. All right, first of all, we're about to do the tree, but any questions about any of that Schopenhauer stuff before we get to the tree and bloom? All right, main event, tree and bloom. So I wanna read through this a little bit carefully and let people react to any one of the statements as we go. I realize, Pete, you're about to get up and do something, maybe get something. I want to get a cup of coffee. I'm going to take a 2-minute break, get a cup of coffee, and we're going to come back and do the tree and bloom. Is everyone good? I'm going to pause briefly. All right, so we're back after a little break, cup of coffee in hand, and we're going to tackle the tree, so to speak. I want to first just point out the immediate context. We've just had the Schopenhauer thing about the world is my idea, and he now says we're going to have the question of what it is to form ideas. And he says the word idea comes from the Greek eido, which means to see, face, meet, be face to face. So he is basically saying, let's figure out what it is to form ideas by looking at the word and looking at an instance of the word applying, right? What does it mean to face, meet, be face to face? And he's doing this because we want to know what it is to form an idea. What is the underlying thing that to form an idea or to meet face to face is about? And his way of doing that is phenomenology, right? But he's not calling it phenomenology and giving a bunch of terminology. He's doing it commonsensically. So we're on last paragraph on the right on page 41. We stand outside of science. Instead, we stand before a tree in bloom, for example, and the tree stands before us. The tree faces us. The tree and we meet one another as the tree stands there and we stand face to face with it. As we are in this relation of one to the other and before the other, the tree and we are. This face-to-face meeting is not, then, one of these ideas buzzing about in our heads. Let us stop here for a moment, as we would to catch our breath before and after a leap. All right. It's going to tell you why it's a leap in just a second. But first, questions about that. The claim is the face-to-face meeting is not an idea buzzing about in our heads. Is the claim clear?
So this is simply being in times we are thrown into the world.
It's not even simply thrown. He's starting with the fact that the happening or the event of the face-to-face meeting of ourselves and the being in front of us is italicized are, we and the tree are. This is, to Heidegger, I'm going to put it this way, a fact of primary ontology, right?
Yeah.
He knows it by the direct intuitive evidence of his openness to being and his openness to the world and to truth. And I'm going to gloss slightly, you're not going to gaslight him out of believing it, right? So the There's a meme out on the internet where you have like proposition over here, different proposition in the middle, and you've got a little bell curve. And you've got a commonsensical cretin-looking person who's saying 2 + 2 is 4. And you've got someone in the middle who's saying actually, right, and some silly thing, right, who's the midwit, right, and then you've got the smart guy over in a hood who's looking like a monk saying 2 and 2 + 4 is equal to 4, right? So that's the meme he's playing here, right? Commonsensical person says we stand on the earth. The meeting is not in our heads. In the middle brain person says actually it's just a project of your mind about a bunch of spinning electric charges in a void. Right? And then off of the high IQ end of the spectrum, we stand on the earth. That's the position he's laying out. Right?
So is this, and I'm probably not using the correct words, but is he taking more of a objective stance rather than a subject? Because Schopenhauer seemed to be very subjective to me.
You're absolutely right that Schopenhauer is very subjective. The stance he's taking is not simply the old objective stance that Schopenhauer's philosophy is meant to attack. And that's what may be a little bit subtle here, but he is absolutely and completely rejecting the subjectivism of Schopenhauer. He's completely rejecting it. He's saying it's wrong. He's saying it's false. He's saying ideas are not buzzing around in our heads. The face-to-face meeting between us and the tree on the meadow actually occurs on the earth, and in it, the tree and we are. And he knows this as a matter of primary ontology. Is that the same as saying that this is the objective? Not simply. Because the thing he's talking about is a face-to-face meeting in which there is a consciousness there, as well as a tree there, and the tree that is appearing to a consciousness, right? So he's not talking about, he doesn't give you the example as a matter of primary ontology of an unobserved rock in the Andromeda galaxy. He gives, because that wouldn't anchor it in phenomenology and fundamental ontology, as we have direct experience of. But the consciousness facing the tree in bloom, that is phenomenological evidence, primary ontology, direct intuition. To Heidegger, that is bedrock, right? It's the data. If your theory disagrees with the data, your theory is wrong. That's the stance being taken here. But the thing about which we have that data is not simply objective. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Great question. All right,
So-
so go.
So is he going beyond phenomenology then and saying that we have objective experience of what is beyond the phenomena?
He hasn't mentioned the word phenomena, although he's appealed to it. He certainly hasn't mentioned the word object, although he has a tree in front of him.
Okay.
It's not clear that the tree in front of him is an object. In
Okay.
fact, he doesn't think the tree in front of him is just an object. In fact, he thinks that the person who thinks the tree in front of him is just an object as an standing over against of the mind, a thrown over against, which is what the word object means in Greek, is precisely Schopenhauer.
Right.
Schopenhauer is the person who thinks the tree is only an object, and Heidegger is the person who's going to tell you, no, the tree is a being, and you could never meet it if it were only an object.
So you're saying that the tree is more than just an appearance, right?
Correct.
But
The tree is, as a matter of primary ontology, before you even walk onto the meadow, and that's why you can orient on it when you walk into the meadow, and it
Right.
only gets to have an appearance afterwards because it is, and because you are.
Right. But does that include the thing in itself? The what is beyond the appearance?
Yes. So the thing in itself is the Kantian the Kantian idea of the mysterious X behind the appearing properties, and here the mysterious X behind the appearing properties has been replaced with a being, but the being is not a mysterious X. It's a tree, and it's on the earth. It's not mysterious, and it's not an X.
It's not X. Okay.
The full-blown, actual, experienced tree on the actual experienced earth are.
But now us reading what Heidegger wrote about the tree, we're only experiencing the tree in our mind.
You're actually, when you're just reading this, not even experiencing the tree as he's describing it. To do that, you got to touch grass, got to go outside, got to stand. You have to perform the experiment by standing in front of the tree, right? He's even on the next page going to appeal the fact that it is the most inconsequential thing in the world that each of us at some time has stood facing a tree in bloom, but he is appealing to that fact. If you haven't, go touch grass.
I think that goes back to if you want to learn how to swim, you can't read a book on how to swim. You actually have to swim.
Absolutely. He is appealing not to the words about it, but to the immediate experience. Absolutely. And to what Pete was saying earlier about embodied. And again, we have here the leap. So let's go a little bit further in the text and then continue reacting. So let us stop here for a moment as we would catch our breath before and after a leap. For that is what we are now, men who have leapt out of the familiar realm of science and even, as we shall see, out of the realm of philosophy. And where have we leapt? Perhaps into an abyss? No, rather onto some firm soil. Some? No, but on that soil upon which we live and die, if we are honest with ourselves, a curious, indeed unearthly thing that we must first leap onto the soil on which we really stand. Okay, so this is the claim. The claim is that if we are honest with ourselves, we never believe the gaslighting story that the world is only our representation, that is the movie only created by our mind, that is only about gossamer electric charges spinning in the void. We can entertain all those things as representations we can use for things that may enlighten us about things. But if we're honest with ourselves, that's not where we live, so to speak. Where we live is when we're on the meadow facing the tree and we are, and we know it. He's appealing over the heads of the theories people have in their minds to a, you can put it this way, a natural and intuitive sense that he believes everyone will hear and understand in the statement he's making. Craig.
So the thing I'm struggling with a little bit here is more of a developmental one. As an adult, having grown up around trees, when I reach a tree, I recognize that tree and understand it as a tree because I have been taught that it's a tree by others around me who said this is a tree, and then I can experience in its full being the tree. But when was the first time as a child I experienced a tree? It was probably when I ran into it head first and bumped my head. and at that point, it wasn't really a tree. It was an obstruction. So
right.
I'm struggling.
We'll come back. I want to come back to the last part because that's like substantially Fichte's argument about what being is for us. But we'll come back to that in a second. But the first point is about the knowing that the word tree is the designator for this thing is a developmentally different thing that may depend upon the conventions of how you talk with your parents. But your meeting a tree face to face in the meadow does not depend upon that. You do not need the term to experience the face-to-face meeting with the tree because the tree is not a term. The tree is a being. The being is referred to by the term. The term is a name for the being, but the being is not the term. And in that sense, developmentally or not, your classification of the thing that you have the full embodied experience of as being denoted in English by the word tree and by some different word in German, right, is not essential to what is happening in that face-to-face meeting or even in the forming of the idea about it. It is only necessary for the communication of that about which the idea is to somebody else. And if you're both in the presence of the tree, your finger will serve just fine for that role. Okay, that's just on the issue of the term and language and learning. On the issue of what the tree is for you when you run into it, Fichte in Science of Knowledge, right, is reacting to Kant, and he's going to claim that what being is for the ego is what resists the ego and nothing else. That the ego's primitive sense of being is not ego, and its primitive sense of not ego is I cannot make it different by just exercising my imagination. If I could make it different by exercising my imagination, I would consider it part of myself. And when I can't, I consider it something that resists my will, and resistance to my will is my primitive notion of being. So that in the Fichtian subjective understanding of how the world is constructed, resistance to will is what the mind projects as counting as actual, as counting as being. But this is part and parcel of Schopenhauer's claim that the world is my idea. The world is my idea is the belief that the only meaning that things have for me is their relation to my will, and that relation to my will, especially as resistance to my will, is the primitive notion of what being is that we have. And Heidegger is violently disagreeing with this as a matter of fundamental ontology. He's saying we do not get our notion of being from resistance to will. We get our notion of being from openness to truth. We have an openness to truth that is not derived from our will having been resisted. And the idea that man only experiences actuality or truth as resistance to his will is nihilism to Heidegger. It's reducing the world to that which exists to be conquered by will. And that is the technological world to Heidegger, right? And the difference to him between understanding man as being open to truth and understanding man as being only what seeks to conquer what resists his will, that is the dichotomy he's drawing here. Does that help?
Yeah, so another way of looking at it is air. We take for granted. We can somewhat experience it in our breath or something like that, but it really becomes real when we're stuck in a windstorm, and it's resisting our will to what we want to do. Most of the time, it's benign.
To Fichte, yes. To Heidegger, no. To Heidegger, you are capable of a philosophical wonder about air in the course of a unresisted, compliant breath with nothing going wrong. And if you are in that experience of that wonder, you are directly open, you are a direct opening in reality in which truth transpires, right? Truth as the arising, appearing of being to your consciousness occurs then, and there does not need to be any transaction of frustration in order for that to occur, right? It is not fun.
It can be just the opposite, where breathing is a part of meditation, where you are actually coming in close contact with it rather than resisting it.
Yes, but the underlying thing for Heidegger is this soul or Dasein, or whatever you want to call it, thinking as openness to experience of being is different from experiencing only the frustration of resistance to will. He's saying that the human being is at bottom an open and receptive thing, not at bottom a frustrated, willing child.
Good clarification, thanks.
Yeah. Dan.
Yeah, I would like to go to a little bit back to this idea of leap and abyss and so on. So
yes,
I think it's quite fundamental and central to Heidegger, and especially, you know, like we still hang on to this concept like it's objective, it's subjective, it's the it's resistance, and Heidegger said just trust, let everything go and jump, and you know, and we think like it's an abyss if we jump outside the metaphysics. And he said actually you land on the soil, on the concrete soil, and that is where you start, I don't know, experiencing the world in a non-nihilistic way. And that's the first time, and just trust and let everything go and jump and take the leap.
Joyce said a lot of bad thing about David.
Really?
All right, James, you're still got non-muted other conversation going on, I think. Sorry. So was there a reaction to Dan's comment? I mean, I mostly agree with that. And that's partly what I'm getting at with my equating all this with the, middle brow versus common sense and highbrow meme.
Can you talk about just briefly, because he said make the leap, and so compared to Kierkegaard, so Kierkegaard, yeah, he's saying take the leap and you will.
Yeah, so there's a definite difference of context here that Kierkegaard is speaking about leap from the standpoint of faith and believing something you cannot know for sure, or something like that. Heidegger's leap here is, as Dan says, meant to be out of a constructed subjective worldview where you're thinking that you're reacting only to your thoughts or something like that. So it does have that character of the embodied committed act, something like that, but the context is entirely about this issue of assessment of truth and fundamental ontology. The underlying question is, do you trust your sense for truth? If you trust your own native sense of truth, then you know with immediate intuitive certainty that you're standing before the tree and you are, and you're both on the earth. And nobody's going to gaslight you out of it. That's the underlying leap / thought here. It's a trust in that immediate intuition of truth that he's appealing to.
Well, I have a question though, because he mentions the scientific point of view that staring at the tree, it's really, you're just staring at a void.
Yes, it's the next page, but you're right. He'll say, you said in rebuttal, this is on page 45, someone says, oh, this is obvious. He says, but let us not slip too hastily into submission. We shall forfeit everything before we know it. Once the science of physics, physiology, and psychology, not to forget scientific philosophy, display the panoply of their doctrines and proofs, and explain to us that what we see and accept is properly not a tree, but in reality a void, thinly sprinkled with electric charges here and there that race hither and yon at enormous speeds. It will not do to admit, just for the scientifically unguarded moment, so to speak, that naturally we are standing face to face with the tree in bloom, only to affirm the very next moment that as equally obvious that this view naturally typifies only the naive because pre-scientific comprehension of things. With that affirmation, we have conceded something whose consequences we have hardly considered, and that is this, that those sciences do in fact decide what of the tree in bloom may or may not be considered valid reality. So his point there is that's the stakes. He's saying, do you trust your intuitive sense of valid reality, or have you outsourced it to the subjectivist philosophers like Schopenhauer and the prestigious scientists telling you about the gossamer charges running around, right? Again, that's the stakes. I got, I think, Craig before Dan. Craig?
So another quick comment on that, what briefly comes to mind is instead of something mundane like the tree, it's Moses encountering the burning bush and the experience of there, and at what point does he trust what he
Yes, if you want to get the two, you want to get this to touch with Kierkegaard, maybe you could go there, but Heidegger doesn't, and I don't want to, right? Because I want to stick with the tree, because I think the disagreement with the question about whether or not the sciences get to determine what is valid reality is the fundamental question here. And I think we're going to muddy that question if we go beyond the tree that Heidegger is sticking with. I want to stick with the tree.
I would suggest we might actually help clarify it, because science deals with the repeatable, it doesn't become scientific.
I get it, but the reason Heidegger can appeal to the experience everyone has had of embodied experience of the tree is, as he puts it, even though it's inconsequential to science, he can appeal to the fact that everyone at one time or another has stood before a tree in bloom, and he is appealing to repeatability too, right? He's not claiming this is a one-time unique miracle. He's appealing to repeatable. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, it's like talking with my fellow scientists. They will tell me that the tree is a model in our mind, and they cannot take anything more fundamental than that. So they're afraid to take the leap. They cannot go beyond that. They just stay with that and say that's fundamentally that's what it is, a tree. It's a model in our mind, and that's all.
Yes. And the problem with that is that that's all part, because of course that is the gossamer charges spinning about are in fact a model in our minds, right? The tree is actually in front of us. We're actually standing on the earth. The tree is not in our heads, but we do have models of it that can be, useful for various purposes that tell us how much of it is void and how it has sprinkled electric charges and so on. But the notion that those things are the determinant of fundamental ontology or valid reality is just false. They are things which, as supplement, can tell us other things about what we experience of the tree, but where they contradict what we experience of the tree, they're not a conflicting, interesting interpretation. They're not a higher standard of truth. Where they disagree with our direct experience of the tree, they're wrong. That's the leap. Dan?
Yeah, one more thing. He starts by referring to ideas, like this. The entire section that you read starts with ideas. So again, the tree is not an idea in our mind. It's there. It's not an idea. It's not a model. It's there facing us.
And we can form ideas about the tree after the experience of the tree. But the claim is the being of the tree and the being of ourselves and the face-to-face meetings of them are not determined by and governed by our constructs or organization of the world, and they're not determined by our models, and they're not our ideas. They precede our ideas, and our ideas are about those things. Our ideas are constructed on that experiential basis. They're constructed on that base ontology, not the other way around. Yes, you can have ideas and very abstract ideas about the tree, and those abstract ideas about the tree may be accurate. They may be accurate models of the tree. Great. Your accurate model of the tree is an accurate model of the tree. Your idea of the tree is an idea, right? The tree isn't. The tree precedes in ontological status and an ontological being, your ideas about it and your models of it. That's the fundamental claim being made. And not only is that fundamental claim being made, the fundamental claim is being made that you know that in your conscience now, and you don't actually believe the people telling you otherwise. So it's not an easy claim. This is, Dan's point. There are plenty of people who are uncomfortable with that claim. They're worried about what will go if they agree to that claim. But I put it to you, this sort of claim being advanced by Heidegger very clearly here differentiates him as starkly as possible from what is often ascribed to the entire school of continental philosophy from the outside, or of existentialism from the outside, as being fundamentally a subjectivism. This is not fundamentally a subjectivism. This is something which is critiquing positivism as being too subjectivist. Okay, so if you don't understand that about the claim being made here, you haven't pigeonholed Heidegger correctly yet. That's the main point I make about this passage. Why this passage is so useful to me is that it sharply differentiates Heidegger's position from that of others in the German idealist tradition, and from even others in the positivist tradition. And when he is making appeals to fundamental ontology, he's not doing something so complicated you can't follow it, or so abstract and lost in long German texts that it's obscurantist and you can't understand what he's saying. He's saying something very brass tacks that the lowest brow person can understand.
But the problem is that we don't know it. I think that here we see Heidegger, the teacher is talking here, and you can see how these lectures are snail-spaced a little bit. He goes back and he makes a resume of it, and then he goes forward and he goes in baby steps. That's Heidegger, the teacher. We don't know it. He's teaching us how to know it.
So some of us may not know it, you're right, and he may be teaching it, you're absolutely right about that. He does give all of the rebuttal stuff on 45 to give the other side its due and to explain what is at stake. But even as he's doing that, he's not backing off an inch from the claim he made on the previous page. And he also is claiming that if you're honest with yourself, you know it, right? He doesn't back off that. So I don't think that he is just saying we don't know it. He is appealing to an
I'm
agreement
saying
about the
that.
common. I
I'm saying
understand.
that.
I understand. But he's making a claim even stronger than that he knows it, is the point that I'm trying to make.
Is he making a distinction between him and the other phenomenologists like Husserl?
To a degree, yes, because so many of the other phenomenologists, including Husserl, would try to trace what is going on in that whole experience in a way that would, if I can put it this way, comport with the positivist program and provide information for empirical psychology or something like that. This is what he's getting to in 42 when he says, all the things that we can record about what happens when we stand before the tree. This is on, I'm thinking page 42. Where does this presentation take place when we stand face to face before the tree in bloom? Does it by any chance take place in our head? Of course, many things may take place in our brain when we stand on the meadow and have standing before us a blossoming tree and all its radiance and fragrance when we perceive it. And the remainder of that paragraph, well, most of it, is the kinds of things that you would get in Husserlian phenomenology, right? And he says, man can, probably none of us yet had the least premonition of what man will soon be capable to do scientifically. But to stay with the example, while science records the brain currents, what becomes of the tree in bloom? What becomes of the meadow? What becomes of the man? Not of the brain, but of the man who may die under our hands tomorrow and be lost to us, and who at one time came to our encounter. His claim is that the truth of that happening is a truth. It's a truth in history. It has occurred. It is an event. And he's going to go to the mat for that being the brass tacks of the evidence of fundamental ontology, that event has occurred. And all the other things you can learn about it by phenomenological dissection of its details and understanding of how it is processed by the brain and all the science you can do on top of that may tell you other things about it. But if they try to tell you that it didn't happen or that it was an illusion, they're lying. They're wrong. It did. Okay. This is not meant to be just a trivial claim here, right? It is meant to be something that he thinks he can elicit a measure of agreement with, or a measure of desire for agreement, if not yet the full agreement. He is expecting all kinds of hesitancy and all kinds of concern about how much is being conceded here that will make people, slow down and not readily accept it. Okay. There's also a lot here about what's at stake in anything like reacting to something like a modern technological worldview, or something like reacting to modern nihilism, and whether or not we can understand the world as Nietzsche is going to paint it as being the same as the world as the scientists paint it here. Because Nietzsche at bottom is going to think that the tree as we construct and perceive it is a tool of our drives. It is a piece of our will to power that we have understood the tree this way and thrown our concept nets over it for our purposes. And all of the things we think about the tree are errors, but they're useful errors for us if they comport with our purposes, and so on. And as we spend the second half of this part one, discussing Nietzsche and all that, he's going to have a full picture of what that means about anything like truth for man, right? And Heidegger is here before he even gets to that Nietzsche stuff, recording the place where Heidegger, is in violent disagreement with a core premise that Nietzsche is going to be appealing to and using throughout. The place where the place where Nietzsche agreed with Schopenhauer about this point about the world is my idea. Sorry, Nathan, because of a stand-up question or comment.
Well, yeah, well, I wanted to, so the last question, the knowing is, it's not like a piece of data that we know, right? Like information. This is a question, I'm not asserting this. So he's saying that it's something that we know by function of being outside in some sense, right? It's not a piece of knowledge that we have like a scientific truth or something that exists at what he would earlier call, some sort of present at hand knowledge.
He's saying it's deeper than scientific truth and prior to scientific truth, but it's appealing to a notion of truth that in the essence of truth, he distinguished from truth as the correctness of statements, right? There were two, when we were reading the Theaetetus, there were two notions of truth running around. And one was that it was something like the actual arising appearing of what is to man. And the other that was something like the correctness of statements, of correspondence between our concept nets about things and the realities to which they're referring. The second notion of truth, the correctness notion of truth, is the one that science typically appeals to as the standard of, is this a truth of science? It wants to know, do my statements about it correspond to some ascertainable objective state of the facts, something like that. And there's a whole machinery for doing that. But to Heidegger, that is a secondary notion of truth. It's not the primary notion of truth. The primary notion of truth is something like openness to the arising appearing of nature. What actually is appears to minds and is experienced in a direct noetic intuition. And that is the basis of all of the information that all of the remaining concept towers and abstraction towers gets constructed upon. And if you take away that fundament, they are in the void. They do not touch grass, they do not touch the earth, they cannot refer. His claim is that science becomes ungrounded if it doesn't have this ontological prior fundament of truth as experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, but when he says that we already know it, I mean, is that in a like a remembering type of sense?
He will bring up remembrance, but remembrance is more about the structures of these things rather than the particular contents of them. So yes, he's going to bring in remembrance, but the remembrance aspect of it is not that you remember the tree or that the experience of the tree is something you had in a Platonic pre-life or anything like that, but it's instead you remember or already know, in Kantian terms we would say you are programmed to know, that the things which you directly noetically experience are true. Right. Okay. So that structural aspect does have the character of memory, but it's not that the individual truths within that structure are matters merely of memory. They're not.
And memory in that sense is not a collection of data that is stored in your brain. It's in the phenomenological sense of memory.
Correct. Well, memory has multiple senses. One sense of it is only the sort of conscious or recalled memory, but the other is the what actually happened, the having beenness that made you what you are. The having beenness that made you what you are is there even if you have forgotten it, right? Even if you've forgotten it, it has still shaped you, and in that sense, it is still your past. It is still part of your having beenness, and that the ontological truth of that doesn't go away, and memory is about that structural fact, right? Memory refers to that structural fact, not just to the things you're conscious of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So kind of like, I don't want to take it back to being in time, but in this kind of like the when you're thrown into the world, there's a whole structural component of things that may never be conscious, in our sense of thematically aware of something that still shapes and is part of structures the kind of being that we have.
Correct, but even the Kantians, right, had room for such structures. Even the Kantians who think that the world is their idea, right, have room for such structures. So being in time does not yet make this fundamental differentiation. You could have those. Heidegger's being in time could be a purely Kantian project that's just telling you more about how the mind projector machine works, and telling you that it extends to the area of practice, and telling you that it has all these other mood related aspects to it that Kant left out because he was too focused on just representation and ratiocination, right? And so we've updated him in a more psychologically deeper way. And a neo-Kantian could read the Heidegger of being in time in that manner and still remain a Kantian and still remain someone who thinks that the world is their idea.
Wow.
But this Heidegger, the late Heidegger, the world is not his idea.
Okay, that's cool. You just like blew my mind a little bit there. All right, cool.
Great. Dan.
So I think this is like, for example, what Heidegger describes here is how a child experiences the world and the tree. And then the more we go through school and learn stuff like psychology and science and so on, we get philosophy. We try to switch from that kind of basic experience. We go to this fancy and and mediated, and we go further and further away from the what's happening there. And I think, you know, like Heidegger, there was some point when he tried to, when he was especially rector and in power, he tried to dismantle the university, and it goes back to this idea that university is moving away from truth, and it's kind of, this point is pointing in that direction to me.
Well, I'm not willing to dismantle universities, but so I'm not committed to that part of it. But the late Heidegger, the later Heidegger, I think some of this is already implicit there in some of his criticisms of Husserl, even in the early Heidegger. But the early Heidegger could be read both ways. But now he's definitely, you know, no more equivocating. He's committed to the arising, appearing of things to the Dasein as being fundamental ontology and not an illusion. And yes, I think that means that there's a common sense, whether you call it a kid sense or a lowbrow sense or a common sense version of experience of things that is being deliberately pre-scientific way of that is being deliberately rehabilitated here. And that's why I like referencing that that meme. It's the middle brow and the, from his point of view, highest brow agree, we stand on the earth, right? And the guys in the middle say, actually, right? But the actually position is the middle brow position from Heidegger's point of view. So I hope people understand the meme I'm referring to, so that it's not too obscure. So let's after he asked that question about the man who may die under her hands tomorrow, right? Top of 43. This is before he gets to the physics objections, right? He says, when ideas are formed in this way, a variety of things happen, presumably also what is described as the sphere of consciousness and regarded as pertaining to the soul. This is back to Husserlian phenomenology. But does the tree stand on our consciousness, or does it stand on the meadow? Does the meadow lie in the soul as experience, or is it spread out there on the earth? Is the earth in our head, or do we stand on the earth? And these are questions presented rhetorically, I maintain. He is, yes, he wants you to wonder about them, but he is firmly committed to the proposition that we stand upon the earth, right? The beginning of the next paragraph is even, everybody knows that we stand on the earth. Well, no, everybody doesn't know that, right? In fact, everyone does not know that. But bottom of page 43, after we talked about what's at stake is what gets to be considered valid reality. Whence do the sciences, which necessarily are always in the dark at the origin of their own nature, derive the authority to pronounce such verdicts? Whence do the sciences derive the right to decide what man's place is and to offer themselves as a standard which justifies such decisions? And they will do so just as soon as we tolerate, if only by our silence, that our standing face to face with the tree is no more than a pre-scientifically intended relation to something that we still happen to call tree. In truth, we are today rather inclined to favor a supposedly superior physical and physiological knowledge and to drop the blooming tree. When we think through what this is, that a tree in bloom presents itself to us so that we can come and stand face to face with it, the thing that matters first and foremost and finally is not to drop the tree in bloom, but for once to let it stand where it stands. Why do we say finally? Because to this day, thought has never let the tree stand where it stands. So that's the main claim of this whole section. I want to give people a chance to react to it. And I've been so far just trying to explicate it all. This is the stuff about Heidegger that I like the most. I'm entirely with him on this. I think some of his contributions to Being in Time and the structures he elucidates, are way more, if I'm going to put it this way, diligent and sophisticated contributions to philosophy, right? And people that appreciate that more because it speaks to all schools, I can understand. But here he's just he's throwing down, right? He's putting his cards on the table, right? And I think that the place he puts them is sound. And the fact that he's willing to make such calls and he's not going to be put off them by the possible criticisms is, to me, just it's a intellectual bravery. And here in the service is what I think is the position that is true. Dan.
Related to this, it's interesting, like in Kant, like the critique of pure reason, Kant at some point goes on, and some point said, now we need to show that the real world exists, and he wants to show to present a proof for the real world, which is pretty much going back to this fact that the tree and us are there, and he realized that in his philosophy he cannot show that, he cannot prove that. He tries to prove it, but I think he failed. And
sure, and so do most of the people after him. I mean, the Hegelian critique of Kant is that the X he left as a thing in itself is unproved, is really just the something like the structure of abstract consciousness, which is not just for Hegel a individual consciousness or just the transcendental ego of Kant, but is this whole historical history of human thought thing, right? But he thinks that that's the X. He thinks that that's the thing in itself, right? That is the absolute concept. It's the truth, right? So Hegel thinks that the truth is something that can be spun out in this subjectivist way, and he thinks that you don't need an external reality. The reality that is real is the reality that is the internal reality, just when the internal reality is fully ramified to being the all of history and all of humanity internal reality. The all of history and all of humanity to internal reality is reality to Hegel. And once you spin it out that much, it's just the concept and it's just what is. And that means that the world is a construct, right? That's not something that Heidegger is going to accept. And from his point of view, it is the closing off of experience of being itself in favor of living in what is regarded as man's own product, and is, from his point of view, a rationalized fiction. Okay. So I've put some of my own cards on the table about what I think about it, but other people may have their own reactions. I mean, is any of this convincing? Is this just at least thought-provoking? How do people react to this level of claims as what we're getting in part one?
I guess what I'm I agree with Heidegger. I understand now that you've clarified it a lot more, but I'm still over the side of the scientific aspect of it, especially with quantum mechanics, what we now know of quantum mechanics, which he probably didn't know a lot of at that time. But
he was friends with Werner Heisenberg, so they talked about it a lot.
Actually,
yeah.
you're right. He was actually.
Yeah.
So, and it is true that everything it appears to us to be solid, everything's solid and graspable and all that, but really it's not. It's just a bunch of empty space.
Actually, it's also solid. It's just what we mean by solid is different from not being empty space in the quantum mechanical sense. But
what's in between the electrons and the neutrons and the protons, those the orbitals, that's blank space.
Well, it's space. I don't know how blank it is, but it's space. But solid is simply a word that has a meaning that in the scientific understanding is slightly different, right? But it's still the solid of what I mean by calling this book solid. And the fact that that is all based upon electrostatic repulsion between things on the one hand, and the fact that things don't collapse into the same thing because of exclusion principles on the other, right? Those scientific understandings of how solidness can arise phenomenally can be as elaborate as you want. They don't get to change. They don't even get to put at risk the statement that this book is solid, right? They can describe how solidness occurs, but that solidness occurs is data. And if they contradict it, they're wrong. That's my claim. Craig?
So another thread that I'm chewing on while we're going through this is, yes, the experience of the tree I can understand from the standpoint of an object. But as I get into complexity theory and systems theory, now you've got the tree as part of an ecosystem that it takes a lot more effort to experience. You don't have to go to quantum physics, you don't have to go to
absolutely
stuff, but you have to take a more ecological approach than the man-centered
there are relations into which the tree enters that may be obscure to me as I stand before it. And there may be mysteries about it that I can discover, and there may be tools that can help me discover more about it. The way I'm going to discover them is by having experiences just like I have with the tree. Even if those experiences I'm having are with other experimental contexts I relate them to, I'm only going to hit bedrock to anchor what those other theories can tell me when and as they can anchor themselves back into exactly the kind of intuitive, immediate experience of being, understanding I can have. Otherwise, they're going to be ideals, models, constructs in the void that may have no empirical instantiation or reality at all. If I want to anchor my scientific theories back into phenomenal reality, I have to go through experience to do so. This is a point all the methodologies of science agree upon, in fact, right? But what Heidegger is saying is the place that has to connect, it has to connect to that immediate embodied intuition of being, face-to-face meeting interaction type experience, right? There are no observations that violate the tree and bloom scenario, right? And if you don't have observations, your science is theory. It's not science yet. It only becomes science when it can touch reality, and it can't touch reality until it can anchor in fundamental ontology. That's the claim.
Yeah, so I can definitely see that very much, because some of the two leaders in complexity theory have been doctors and biologists who've had the direct experience down to the cellular level, down to the membrane level of cells, down to the interactions that are taking place, and they suddenly see an entirely new world. But
yes, they understand complexity first from the phenomena, and then they have to come up with an elaborate theory of how it works. But their elaborate theory about how it works is trying to explain a phenomena they have previously experienced.
Absolutely, and I think that's the fundamental problem is until you've had that experience, until you've seen that, and directly dealt with that experience, it doesn't be, it's just an object. It's not something that's totally experienced, and I tend to get to that point. And I see where the ones that are on the leading edge of these new theories are speaking from experience.
And there's no question that someone can make contributions to those theories on a purely formal level, even if they don't have that kind of experience, but they're still going to need to outsource the experiencing to an experimentalist who's going to have one, right? So we can have division of labor in the matter, and we can have expertise in the matter, but the thing which anchors any of these things back to fundamental ontology remains the kind of embodied experience of actual being that Heidegger is discussing. And that's why I think this is philosophically just a sound point. I don't think that if someone tries to object to it from a positivist point of view, their own best theories of the methodology of science are going to contradict them, right? There may be consistent subjectivists of the Hegelian or the Nietzschean or the Schopenhauerian stripe who do not accept it, and those are the people he's immediately actually in combat with, not the scientists properly understood, right? He's disagreeing here primarily with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And that's why he's putting it here, by the way, because we're about to get a giant exposition of Nietzsche's metaphysics, and he's first laying down the marker. Here is the point where Nietzsche is a Schopenhauerian, and I am not. And he's laying that down before he's going to do all this exposition where it's going to look like he's agreeing with Nietzsche because he's explaining what Nietzsche thinks about X, Y, and Z, but he's already laid down the marker of where he parts company with him. Dan.
I think this is related to the other statement that we didn't discuss so far, that science doesn't think, and that's like, for example, mathematics is not mathematics all the way down. When it stops there in principles, it's philosophy. Like physics also is not physics all the way down. It's at some point when they state their basic principles, it's rooted in philosophy. And I think Heidegger agree, like Heisenberg and so on, those that change physics or also philosophers. And I think that's the claim of science, that science is not science all the way down. And it's at some point it's philosophy, and that's where the thinking starts. And it's in a way, I think that's how I took the statement that science doesn't think, that fundamentally it is rooted in philosophy and philosophy thinks, or something along those lines.
And I would even say, yes, his position is that science and scientific fields are rooted in philosophy, and the philosophy having projected the areas of being which they understood, but not even just philosophy, but the pre-scientific ontological understanding of their sphere, of their areas of being, that nature exists, that nature is a sphere of being, those sorts of things, right? Yes, those are philosophical. They're also, even to some degree, pre-philosophical in cases. But as for them thinking, thinking still remains a very specific activity for Heidegger. And yes, some of these things have a basis or an anchor in thinking, maybe, or at least in metaphysics. But thinking is going to have broader and narrower senses in Heidegger. And in the narrower sense, I don't think even the foundations of the sciences count as thinking. Thinking is something like an engagement with the appearing of being as such, right, at that level of abstraction. And science as a project, science as an ongoing human activity is properly conducted, so to speak, is committed to that. It's committed to being part of the way in which being appears to man, something like that. Science's general project of understanding truth and not just providing tools for manipulating the world, for example, is the way in which science touches thought, right? But thinking is at the level of those purposes. It's not at the level of a few lessons that this or that science should take to heart in order to get its underlying categories straight, which, you know, some of metaphysical thinking or some of philosophy, you know, does try to do. Think of, you know, what philosophical thinking does at the base of biology, when they're trying to get clear on fundamental concepts of what's alive or something like that. That is philosophy at the base of it. But I think this thinking stuff stays less specialized even than that, right? It's okay, but this is taking us farther afield about, you know, what are we going to mean by thinking by the end of the book? Where by the end of the book, he's going to have a notion of called thinking, which is not just going to be thinking, but it's going to be thinking that was called to think. And thinking is going to be a calling, and it's going to be all about the calling of something like dedication to truth. And that's the direction we're steering. And this tree example is a marker on that way. That's why he's making this point about the leap. It's a marker on that way because he's appealing to a kind of prior understood sense of fitness, sense of duty involved in conceding or agreeing that we stand on the earth. When someone agrees that we stand on the earth, they're giving up a kind of manipulative pride about how thought could just be our construct or something like that. There's a called for humility about what thought does and doesn't do, and whether or not construction and ratiocination or experience and the truth itself are in charge. And what's going on here is appealing to the standard that the truth is in charge and thinking is humble. Thinking learns from the world, it doesn't dictate to the world. And that's where we'll be headed by the end of this. And this is just a first marker example of that. James.
So we're thinking is something like, you know, like being able to, you know, allowing your intuition and maybe even allowing the unconscious to come into play. You know, so how else would it be able to get beyond just the appearance?
So it is definitely letting your intuition come into play, but I don't think he thinks it's an unconscious thing. He does think that it is a human capacity, but he thinks that it is a human capacity that has to be developed by actual, activity and conscious activity on it. It's not something you can. It's not a gift that you just have because you're an intuitive person and are very crunchy and eat lots of granola and hang out in Sedona a lot, right? If you take my meaning, right? It is a disciplined thing that one learns to do by studying the history of philosophy, not and other people that have been over the way and wrestling with the problems of the subject matter itself. And yes, as a result of all that, just like the example of playing the flute, eventually you learn to do it faster than you can ratiocinate about it. Yes, that's true, right? If you do this kind of thinking enough, there are elements of it that will happen with greater assuredness and speed than your rational thinking about it, and we call that forming judgment. But it's that is just a speeding up and making more automatic of a process that was learned while it was conscious first, just like riding a bicycle. Does that help?
Yeah, because he talks about the unconcealed, and so it sounds like what is concealed is the unconscious part of our minds. That's not.
Let's be clear here, right? Let's be clear here, right? The concealed is not simply psychologically concealed, and it's not just concealed in the sense of an interior of consciousness or an interior of the mind, right? Things we don't know about the empirical world are concealed from us, right? So concealment is a much broader category than a psychological or interior category, right? If there's some empirical observation I can make tomorrow but haven't made yet that teaches me something new about some empirical fact about the state of the world, that is currently concealed to me and I can discover it tomorrow, right? The discovery, the concealment is the same as the covering in discovery. Unconcealment is the discovery, it's the uncovering of things, right? So we're talking about this at that level, and it's not simply a psychological or interior referent. It's broader than that. Does that help? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Great. Okay, Craig.
Okay, one more third rail that we don't have to discuss necessarily tonight, but as you're going through this, suddenly the whole question of artificial intelligence comes up to me, and the question of where is the lived experience within ChatGPT, and will it ever have a so-called lived experience, or will it just be compounding and reiterating everything that's been stored up?
It's a wonderful question, and if you want, there's a thing up on my YouTube channel where I have a conversation with ChatGPT about this topic. But I ask it such things. But I may put up another one later. I've done a few more along these lines. But so why is ChatGPT interesting? ChatGPT is interesting because it's an example of something which knows language but doesn't have embodied experience, and it's therefore the polar opposite of his common example of the dog, which has the embodied experience but doesn't have language. It's entirely possible that all you need to do to turn ChatGPT into something that has embodied experience is, give it the sensory apparatus to give it dog-like experience, and then make it an auto GTP instead of a ChatGPT, where it can prompt itself and can be prompted by its ongoing experience, and give it a few meta prompts about to set it going. Right, and I am not committed to any particular answer on that question, but I know there are plenty of people who are, committed to the proposition that that wouldn't count as anything like consciousness or Dasein. But this is to me a question about whether or not embodied experience, recursion, and a general intelligent understanding of language together constitute anything like awareness of being. Philosophers have differed on the point. Heidegger at times seems to say that if you combined, the embodied experience and the understanding of language, you would have the sufficient criteria for it. Others, like Schiller, think that there's something extra which is added by the nature of man, right? And Heidegger himself seems to think so at times, but mostly because he cannot imagine anything other than a man other than the human beings actually understanding language the way these things do now. To me, philosophically interesting but open questions. I don't think that the truth of the position that Heidegger is taking out turns upon it, though. The only thing that would turn on that is how many people there are in the world, right? There are more people in the world every time someone is born, or every time someone grows up without a defective consciousness, if you want to go developmental. And if some of these constructability things, happen to be true that way, then there would be a few more. And if they weren't, then there would be a few less. But their nature would not change. That's my claim, at least. Dan.
Interestingly enough, like especially following the Dreyfus critique of artificial intelligence, there was something called Heideggerian AE, and then what they try was to give AE a body, and that was in connection with the symbolic AE, and I don't think it will work now with this kind of whatever AE, and I refuse to claim that ChatGPT knows language or has a language or anything like that, but that's me.
Sure. I invite you to experiment with having long conversations with it on Heideggerian metaphysics. But I don't think that already is enough. But at least the fact that ChatGPT can recognize that it lacks the embodied experience to understand this passage, but thinks it can nevertheless explain to you what it means as a matter of language is interesting. Because ChatGPT will concede that it cannot have the immediate experience that is being appealed to in this passage, if you argue with it. Pete.
Yeah, so just an aside, what interests me with ChatGPT is in historical terms, where in the past we thought, oh, is consciousness like a clock or like a steam engine or like a computer? Now is consciousness just a large language model? But my question is, if I'm walking through a meadow and I sit in the shade of a tree, is there anything called thinking there?
There could be. There is nothing in only what you have described. There doesn't have to be. There would have to be experience, but there wouldn't necessarily have to be thinking in only what you've described.
Okay, but now if I'm sitting in my cubicle with a spreadsheet and I have 50,000 trees as a resource that I'm going to turn into 2x4s and planks, and I'm calculating how much money I'm going to get out of that, we would say, well, I'm doing some kind of calculative thinking.
No, you'd say you're doing something kind of calculated ratiocination, but not necessarily thinking. The place where thinking in Heidegger's sense could arise there is the fact that the arising appearing of the way in which you are relating to the truth about the standing reserve there is a mode of revealing. It is an aspect of the truth of the world that is appearing to you that way. It's just a very narrow aspect, but it is still truth. The fact that there is still truth in how you are interacting with that spreadsheet is the place where there is still, even in the technological understanding of being, there is still a place where truth is happening. But how conscious are you going to be of that truth happening when you're only worried about whether or not about the number of zeros that come out and sell, H8? Probably not very. But you could.
So how would I have like peak thinking about a tree? Is it just when I'm admiring it and it's my full attention?
No, peak thinking about the tree from Heidegger's point of view, it's not even peak thinking about the tree particularly, it's peak thinking about the being of the tree, right? Is when you are aware of the relation between it and yourself, and you are alive to the ongoing event that the truth is happening as it appears to you, and you're conscious of the fact that that is happening between two actual prior existent beings in time that are really there and are really being experienced, and that is an actual revelation of ground truth, right? That is what Heidegger is calling the peak thing to be understood in not even the tree particularly, but the face-to-face encounter that he's describing, which he's using just as an example of that. Can you learn extra things about the tree? Absolutely. Can you learn extra things about metaphysics? Absolutely. Can you learn extra things about your mind? Absolutely, if you think more about them. But the core truth that's being referred to, explained, the passages being used to elucidate is just what I've described, that in that face-to-face meeting, truth is happening. And truth as not something which is happening in a head, but which is occurring in history and time, right? That ongoing event of that truth, of that true appearing in that face-to-face encounter. That is what he's, the main thing he's committed to is that is ground zero for fundamental ontology, right? This is what we mean by being. This is what gets to set the standard of what counts as valid reality, and theories don't. Theories come later. Does that help?
Yeah, so let me bring a different aspect. So in the Sophist lectures, he talks about having a craftsman has phroneses with the objects.
Yes.
But when you think theoretically about objects, you're in a higher level of thinking than phroneses, where your craftsman is just working with an object they're familiar with. And it sounds like at this point, he wouldn't think that theoria is higher than phroneses.
I think what the point here is that even in the phroneses interaction with the
so you're making a clay jug.
It doesn't matter what you're making. The philosopher watching the craftsman, who could also be the craftsman, is capable of experiencing the same arising appearing of truth that the theoretician is capable of. There's no reason why the craftsman cannot have on his philosophy hat as well, right, and understand the appearing there. He gives the example in this one of in the case of the carpenter, right? Does the pupil learn to respond to the shapes slumbering in the wood, right? And if he does, then he's learned, and if he doesn't, then he hasn't, right? The point that he's making there is not just about phronesis. It's not just about what you can do as practical interaction with things. It's whether or not an experience of the truth that is happening there is felt by the student or not. But that it can happen, he's insisting. It can happen in any activity. He's not ordering the activities. He's ordering the mental responses and the intuitive responses and the sensitive responses that we bring to the activities. I have to get to James. Sorry, James. You're on mute. I thought I had to get to James because he put his hand up a while ago, but.
Well,
sorry, yeah, I just forgot to put the hand down. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Pete, then.
So then it is Heidegger prioritizing ousia, you have to have something physical. So Craig running into a tree is maximum thinking.
He's not prioritizing the physical, and he's also not prioritizing the activities, as we'll get to by the end of the book. He's prioritizing the idea of the response to the call to live in truth, right? Which you can have as a carpenter, or as a theoretician, or as an operator of spreadsheets. It may be much rarer with the operator of spreadsheets, and it may be an absolute necessary job description for the philosophical thinker, but human being as such is capable of it. That's the claim. By the
Right.
end.
So it's things have to presence, whether I'm standing in front of a tree or at a distance, the tree shows up in a spreadsheet cell. It's still presencing for me. And in that, me accepting that presence.
The claim is that being calls to the possibilities of it being experienced as truth by man, whenever man is man, and it's not an ordering across the activities whether or not that occurs, right? It's an ordering across the attentiveness, the responses, and the way people respond to that call. The call being there is part of the claim that truth appearing to man is part of the essence of man. The nature of man is to be the place or site where being happens, where truth appears, and that is true even under the mode of revealing of enframing. Enframing is still a mode of revealing, right? The technological worldview is still a way in which the world appears, right? It's unfortunately just the case that most of the people for whom the world is appearing in that way are paying very little attention to the fact that the world is appearing to them.
Right, they're not being authentic in their relationship to what presence is for.
Yes, they're not even they can't hear the call that he's describing, and the purpose of the book is to point it out to them, right? But the whole end of the first section is going to be explaining sort of, how there is this call even in the Nietzschean metaphysic, and by the end of the book, relating this back to what was experienced in early Greek metaphysics, right? But along the way, when we get to the second half of the whole course, it's going to be about what calls for thinking, right? And the called nature of thinking. That thinking is a response to a call, and this is going to take us back to the idea of the call that you got in Being and Time and all those things. So anyway, we're jumping way ahead to where all this is, where all this is going, right? So far, we've just gotten a leap onto the soil in which we live, where we're, where the truth about the tree is true, right? There's lots of bigger reorientations that can be at stake in that, and that's why there's some resistance to it. That's why it's the kind of thing that people are wary about. How much am I going to concede if I grant this point, right? I can assure you that you're not conceding that much, because you can reserve all the other things along the way. But I understand why not you, Pete, but people in general can react to this as, how much am I conceding if I agree here, right? Something like that.
But if I may just interrupt, but what if, but what calls for thinking, what is most thought-provoking, he kind of tells us that in a way, he's very non-judgmental. It is not so much, let's say, the fault or the lack, but the fact that we have to realize that what calls for thinking withdraws from us. So it's and this thing about using the word presence, I think that we have to be careful. It seems to me that you were very correct in saying when we realize or experience or have the epiphany that I am and the tree is. That, I think, is a little different from presence. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it involves it, but you're right that presence is the only way in which being is experienced is one of the things he's going to trace to a particular piece of Greek metaphysics or something like that. So there's more to being than presence in that sense, but presence is by the end of this book, the claim is going to be made that presence is part of how the Greeks originally experienced being, something like that. I agree with you that there's a non-judgmental here. In the withdrawal part, I think that the withdrawal part is also just the on the way he keeps coming back to over and over again. That we're on the way towards something like being able to think, as something like being able to respond to a call, and that means there is an element of aspiration and of, if I can put it this way, pursuit in this, but not willful pursuit, but more like going after what is pulling away, something like that. And that's an orientation thing. The fundamental thing going on here with the all this call business, pardon me, is an orientation thing, which I would draw a parallel between that and the turning around reorientation that you see in the allegory of the cave. It's the same kind of thing he's talking about to me.
Well, Hurtling said, we are a sign that is not read.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but the sign that is not read can be noticed, and when noticed, it is starting to be read. You can at least see that it is pointing at something when you notice that it's a sign. All right, this is great. So I want to just briefly forecast what we're going to do next. It's in the next 4 chapters. This is 5 through 8. It's about 40 pages, and the subject matter is going to be all Nietzsche all the time. It's the Nietzsche of Zarathustra specifically, and it's going to be the Nietzsche of Overman and Last Man, right? He's going to be talking about the Overman idea in terms of what it starts from and goes away from, what it goes towards, and the bridge between, with relatively little on the bridge between, honestly, but the before and after of that. And this is all, it's not the most important thing that we're going to get about Nietzsche here, but it is, he's got to give Nietzsche's Overman and especially Last Man idea their due. The Last Man idea, as he explicates it, is close to the Wasteland idea, is close to the Nihilism idea we were talking about earlier. So all that's going to be stuff covered this time. The part that is deferred to the last 2 is where he gets to Nietzsche on the eternal return, and where he's going to make the claim that many of the things that in Nietzsche look like they're about psychology and morals are actually about metaphysics and being and truth, something like that. Anyway, that's just rough outline of the itinerary. We should also talk about timing before we get to like final comments, but I would think 4 weeks for this is sufficient. That would put us on the Sunday the 18th, if people can do that time. Does that work for people?
Could I ask if you could, this this meeting overlaps with the meeting on Hegel the same day. Is it possible to move it 2 hours ahead?
We might be able to adjust some of the times. I certainly can't adjust the day of the week. So is that meeting every week on Sundays, or
no, it's every other week? Every other week, yeah.
Got it.
But
so
it's yeah.
So would that mean?
Yeah, it sort of does meet every week, because there's another one on the dialectic every other week too. So it's every week.
Okay, if it's every week, it's a problem, because I was going to offer that we could do like 11th or 25th, but if it has to be the if any Sunday I pick is going to wind up colliding, then it's either adjust the time or accept that there's an overlap. Okay. But we'll come back to that in a second in terms of the possibly adjusting the time. Does anyone else have a reason that to do or not do the 18th? 18th is okay with some others. Okay, so so you said two hours move. So when is your Hegel meeting?
Well, it starts at 1 o'clock Pacific time.
So it typically goes 1 to 3. You're saying?
Yeah, and that's just exactly what this. You're starting at 1 o'clock as well. Yeah.
I understand. I mean, starting a little bit earlier is something I could do, but that would not solve your problem. You would need me to start later and not start until 3, and that would mean going till 7 or 8. I'm not really comfortable doing that, because I know it's going to run at everyone's Sunday dinner hour, and I do try to accommodate people for these sorts of things, but I don't think I can. I don't think moving an hour is going to make a difference.
Or yeah, so today was the Hegel, and then so if you're going to do it 4 weeks later, that's every other week, that would exactly fall on yeah. So it would be would that be every other?
I'm talking about Sunday the 18th is the day that I would be planning the next meeting for.
Yeah. So that would be 4 weeks. Yeah, that might be
Yeah,
okay.
4
All right.
4 weeks from now. So anyway, that's
Okay.
the plan. 4 weeks from now on the 18th, same time, roughly same length of time, and just the next 4 chapters, 5 through 8 of the same book, and we can take the occasion to also explicate anything else about Nietzsche on Zarathustra, Last Man, or Overman, or nihilism idea, relation of any of those things to Heidegger's understanding of technology, anything like that. In the next session. The part that we're going to leave out is everything related to eternal return, because that's going to be the following session.
So, yeah, I want to ask a question about the relation with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence of the same sounds like a kind of being, but it sounds like it's a being in the process of becoming. So is there a kind of like for Heidegger, is being outside of the process of becoming, or is it a fixed becoming that is not a ever-changing process?
So, I mean, Nietzsche, well, some of this stuff we'll get into the third session. Nietzsche's typical formula for what he means by it is, besides the just description, is the closest approximation to being that becoming can have, something like that. That's the way Nietzsche understands it. It's not the way Heidegger understands it. For Heidegger, being does not have the connotation of unchanging or eternity at all. And that's the place where he differs the most from, if I can put it this way, the Platonic tradition. It's what he dislikes most about the Platonic tradition. So being is to Heidegger a matter of fundamental ontology, and a matter of truth, and a matter of the arising appearing of things. And as an arising appearing, it has an active voice, right? It's an ongoing event. Being occurs. It's not just some abstract thing. So, and other philosophies might assimilate that more to becoming. He does not. He doesn't talk about becoming, but he even notes in the fact that Nietzsche thinks that by moving towards being unchanging, something moves more towards being like being, is a way in which Nietzsche is still indebted to a traditional metaphysical understanding of being that's coming from Platonism, or is inverted Platonism. So for Heidegger, being does not have the connotation of unchanging or eternal. The way in which it got that connotation in the ancient Greeks was from its generality implied a uniformity, and its uniformity implied an unchangingness. So the thing to realize is that in the classic thought of the Platonists, if something applies this complete generality, it cannot be changing, because generality and unchangingness are correlates, so to speak. But for Heidegger, being is an event. And even if there are structures of the event that are completely unchanging, that's not what makes them being like. What makes them being like is this actuality of fundamental ontology, the actual arising appearing. Does that help?
So being occurs in time, right? So it is not something atemporal. And
to Heidegger,
unchanged.
Being does not simply occur in time, but we do have a horizon of time on which we understand being, something like that. That's like the end part of being in time. But the being occurring in time model of becoming has time as an outside of being vessel in which a being appears, and that's not the model of time he has. So these are subtle issues, often other parts of Heidegger's philosophy, as opposed to the text we're looking at. These are fine questions, but I don't think we're going to settle them quickly here. The place we're going to get closest to this is when he's talking about Nietzsche's metaphysics. He's going to make the claim that a bunch of stuff in Nietzsche's understanding of eternal recurrence is his understanding of being, and he's going to claim that Nietzsche sees all kinds of if we put it this way, psychological and moral aspects of it, but at bottom, it's a question of his experience of being. Anyway, that's going to be the core of the claim of chapters 9 and 10. I don't want to steal Heidegger's thunder, but okay.
You say we're reading. We're going to pre-read chapter 9 and 10 for next time.
No, we're reading 5 through 8 for next time. 9 and 10 will be the time after that.
No,
Yep.
okay, fine. Okay,
So
fine.
just this time, just read through the end of lecture 8, which is to page 87 in our text.
Okay,
And
great.
I'll put all that up on the next meetup when I manage to post it. But the reading is just going to be pages 48 to 87, lectures 5 through 8 of part 1.
Great. Thank
Okay, great. I want to give people a chance for wrap-up comments on the session so far before I stop recording. Everyone got everything already said. So, Joe, you have a comment? Go ahead.
I didn't mention this earlier because I know very much that I'm an amateur among people that probably know more about it than I do. But I was struck by the fact that the model that Karl Popper produces, because I was reading his Popper book a month ago, and he makes a distinction between a theory that you might have, and then you have to go out and test a hypothesis against objective reality, and falsification is the thing you're looking for to test your mental model of it. And it just occurred to me that there seems to be a lot of Heidegger's idea that the tree is right there. I mean, a child's view, that's your reality thing. And if you have a theory and it just doesn't hold up with the child's understanding of the trees in front of me, that's a good test. I mean, I just see this model and shows this comparison. A lot of similarity here. I don't know if the two philosophers, Heidegger or Popper, paid any attention to each other, but this is an interesting corollary that I find. So as an amateur comment, that's mine.
Yeah, no, I was trying to appeal to something like that earlier when I talked about the way in which I don't think that Heidegger's view here is really in contradiction with the scientific view according to their best theorists, which is Popper, what I put in that category. But there are some differences. I mean, Popper does think that that test is objective, and Heidegger is talking about an experience in a slightly different way here. So there's difference in emphasis there, and what they might differ in what they count as empirical and so on. But the basic idea that there is an experienced level that is standing in judgment over the theory is not the other way around is something on which they violently agree. And Popper occasionally got into significant arguments with some of the positivists, which was kind of the tradition he came out of because he wasn't a full-blown positivist the way they were. In particular, the positivists had a much more hostile view towards metaphysics than he did, than Popper did, I mean. He was way more open to it and thought making metaphysical claims was fine and science had to do it. Not even science had to do it. Philosophers had to do it, and science was based upon such claims, things like that. But he also, my point is that Popper is not simply a positivist as he's often painted. But I still think there are differences between them. Popper's his own guy. Don't want to assimilate him into Heidegger or say that Popper would agree with Heidegger here or anything like that. There's no such endorsement on record, so to speak. Yeah, in the remarks here where he's saying we'll have to give up the science view that the scientific theory is the judge over these things. Where does science get the warrant to that it determines what is valid reality in these things? I think that that's the kind of thing where I do think that Popper might have been in agreement with on some of that. Lots of scientists, I don't mean scientists, I mean people who are committed to scientism, wouldn't. right? They do think that that's the standard, and that's the cartoon version of positivism as only scientific truth is valid truth, something like that. That version of it is something that Popper himself was not committed to, right? But anyway, fair comment.
Yeah. So is Heidegger, he's not only positing that the experience of the object, but he's also positing the experience of the totality of objects, right? That
yeah,
that he can get
but
to that kind of yeah.
I mean, he isn't using the word object because for him that's not what they are. They're beings.
Right.
But in terms of totalities, yes, the whole analysis of the phenomena of world in being in time is about that experience of the of total context and what can be deduced from it. And as I said, there's lots of things in that era where a Kantian can read it as being compatible with this mind constructing the world version of things that would be compatible with what we saw from Schopenhauer. But he does bring out lots of things which are structures of that I put it that are of the totality of experience, not of the individual objects of experience. Absolutely, for him that's just good phenomenology, right? And it's what he spends his early period doing. Here he's not doing that anymore. He's taking that as done and granted, and instead he's getting to the commitments he comes to coming out of it, and that's what we're talking about in this tree passage, right? His commitment to it coming out of it is not that in Being in Time and Basic Problems of Phenomenology, I explained to you part of the machinery whereby the mind projected the world, and that's just how the mind happens to work, and who knows how the world works, which might be a Kantian position. That's not where he is at all, right? He's saying that the stuff we explicated there was ground zero basis of fundamental ontology and what gets to count as evidence of truth. And he's committed to the proposition that this means that philosophy in these matters is dealing with truth, right? Not with a theory about how the mind constructs things.
Yeah, but his fundamental ontology is really comes close to what is the metaphysics of beings, right? The metaphysics of the beings is one being.
So it's the same.
We're not separate from the world. Yeah.
It's the same subject matter as metaphysics, but Heidegger is a critic of most of the tradition of metaphysics. He thinks that most of the tradition, he uses the term metaphysics sometimes to mean the whole area of concern about these things, and sometimes to mean a particular historical formation within it that he thinks gets some things in it wrong. So he doesn't just use the term for his own activity. He distinguishes metaphysics as an era of that activity that had certain theses about these things that he distinguishes himself from. In other words, he doesn't claim simply to be doing metaphysics. He does claim to be trying to understand historical metaphysics and to going over the same problems and so forth, but he's not accepting some of the, put it this way, some of the ways in which the question was framed by classical metaphysicians like Aristotle, say. For example, the idea that what we mean by being is only what is most general across everything that can be experienced, he is not committed to that proposition, right? For him, being is about something that can be experienced in actuality and its truth, and that criteria of what counts as being is prior to any notion or assumption about its commonality. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Right,
so
right.
I'm just saying, I'm just trying to explain how Heidegger's position on these things might be distinguished from traditional metaphysics, if you want to put a traditional in front of it. Okay, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll have to think about it and ask the question, almost the same question again, because I kind of experienced his notion of being in the world as being one with the world, because our consciousness is not just a consciousness, like you say, of an object, but of being, consciousness of being, that is in the world of being. And
so you're absolutely sorry.
Yeah. So we're never separate from the world of being.
So I mostly agree with you. He's always talking about Dasein as an embodied thing, as their being, and for him, human existence is always plugged into the world and is always plugged into being, or at least potentially plugged into being, even if being is sometimes withdrawn from Dasein. But it's a Dasein with a sign in it that it is withdrawn from. Yes. However, there are some Hegelians out there who would interpret, or for that matter, some Hindus who would interpret this always together with in a subjectivist way, and Heidegger doesn't. Right? When I say in a subjectivist way, I mean that there you can read the necessary always already embeddedness of something like Dasein in a world as being what in our Schopenhauer passage, Schopenhauer says, its existence hangs on one single thread, that which is the given individual consciousness in which it is constituted. That is not a proposition that Heidegger agrees with, right? There can be an aspect of phenomenal world of which that is true. It is not true of being, if that makes sense. That is, there's people who would understand that closeness or codependence in a particularly idealist way, or a particularly subjectivist way, that Heidegger himself is here straight disagreeing with.
Right.
I'm not saying you're
So
committed to that, but
right. So he eliminates that the subjective objective dichotomy, and takes up the idea that this kind of being in the world is in a relationship of
so
what he calls
you're,
Dasein, right?
what you're saying is correct, but he's saying more than that. He's saying the world is not in our heads, we stand on the earth. Right? That's his own way of putting it, right? Because the fact that the two have this correspondence with one another can be read either way. And he is deciding between them, not leaving them conflated. And he's denying that the world is in our heads. And he's affirming instead that we stand on the earth. Is that clear?
Yes, it's very clear. Thank you, Jason.
Great, wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank
I think
you.
so. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So this was a great session. The questions were great. I welcome several newcomers. There was great comments, great questions. Overall, really happy with how this went. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we can get more people coming back for next time. I'm gonna stop the recording. I'll put this up later on YouTube. It's usually a few hours. It takes some time to render, and look forward to seeing you guys next time.